Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer think tank in Delray Beach. This podcast is about American government intervention in Central America. We are covering Noam Chomsky's book, Turning the Tide, U.S. Intervention in Central America and the Struggle for Peace. The book is about the U.S., mass murders of the government, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, for the most part, but it includes multiple other presidents. And it is about their, slaughter campaign, their, human rights slaughter, their slaughter of human rights, their angry vigilante whites that did, all sorts of things against the great Hispanic and the great Latin American peoples, similar to their actions against the great Asian peoples. And so let us discuss these white vigilante racist butchers of Washington in this podcast and, discuss it. I will do a background and then I will read the book. I just want to make you aware that in the case that I have to cut the video in half, the second half of the chapter will be in the second video. So please look at the link. You can download the book from my Google shared link so that you can, see the Google link, and it will provide you with the appropriate, stuff. So just hold 1 second. This up because it's a little too high. See your face. Okay, so let's get started. So this is Turning the Tide, U.S. Intervention in Central America. The great Hispanic and great Native peoples, the great African peoples, and the great Asian peoples, all of which comprise the great peoples of the Third World, were endurers of torture and abuse and rape, murdered at the hands of the U.S. government, colonial bestial white butchers and their European allies, for which the U.S. government has remained silent in a vicious, jealous campaign of hate and sadistic, cruel, bestial butchery. The racist, anti-Third World ethnic butchers and mass murderers, American politicians and president, allowed these things to happen without check or inquiry. Their media and academia frauds and angry whites slaughtered the great Third World peoples, including Hispanics, including those from South America and Central America, as well as Indonesians, Chinese, Indochinese, including Cambodians, Laotians, and Vietnamese, and Africans, including South Africa, Mozambique, and Angola, and hid these crimes like vicious, criminal, sadistic mass murders. Premeditated American racist, vigilante, anti-Third World, white, ethnic people, racist murderers were totally reckless and remorseless in their crimes against these great Third World peoples. Angry white supremacists and sadistic, cruel, racist American white butchers of Roman Catholicism have blatant disregard for Third World peoples and remain enemies of the Third World in search for liberation and democracy. Masters of subversion and ethnic Third World, savage white butchery. The American government enslaves the great Third World peoples for their capitalist, angry frauds of American and European corporations. The hateful white vigilante racist peoples of America murder ethnic people recklessly and remorselessly and without any shame. We must discuss the actions of the mass murdering sadists of Washington and the United States in Latin America, Asia, and Africa in the context of butchery of the great Third World ethnic peoples of these lands. The angry white people fail to sympathize or even be knowledgeable of their hideous crimes against these great Third World peoples. The U.S. government maintains several freedoms. The white, racist, hateful, anti-Third World and anti-ethnic vigilante butchers of America provide freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, including fraudulent media, and freedom of assembly. But the white butchers of America have another freedom, the freedom to rob and exploit from the great Hispanic and Native Americans and the great Asian and African peoples. This freedom is often used in genocides against these people, when you can't take money secretly and covertly, like Washington so often does, without anyone even knowing about their fabrications, falsifications, omissions, and deliberate lies. Then you must take it by force. This requires sadistic murder by U.S. government, white agents of Congress, and the president. The propaganda system is set up by the cruel sadists of the American Congress and president. They inform the agenda to their white frauds in the New York Times and Washington Post and provide their prestigious quote unquote frauds with the news that they need printed. These are often news that involve the need to mass murder the people, but are framed in a way that the people targeted, always the third world ethnic peoples, including the great Hispanic, Asian, and African peoples, have some problem. That allows them to build a case to cause sadistic cruelty in order to achieve the ends of slavery, rape, murder, and torture. That is the white, angry, vigilante American Congress and president. For example, Jimmy Carter was in power when Jose Napoleon Duarte was the leader of the El Salvadoran regime. Mr. Carter, the human rights democratic white fraud, sadistic, detached, murderous, bestial butcher, backed a coup in El Salvador to bring a vicious regime to power in 1979. The killings of the great Hispanic and Indian natives of El Salvador then dramatically increased. The murderous junta collapsed in front of Carter and was replaced by another murderous regime, which Carter continued to funnel money and aid into to continue the slaughter fest started by the U.S. butchers of Congress. Carter also backed Anastasio Somoza, who waged war against the residential great Hispanic and Indian natives of Nicaragua and was responsible for hundreds and thousands of murders. The sadistic, cruel, detached butcher in Washington even went so far as to try to replace Somoza and institute Somocismo, or Somoza policies without Somoza. Despite popular opinion in Nicaragua being for the Sandinistas and not for a military junta. This is in keeping with the U.S. sadists who Congress and presidency who work to ensure that the subjugated great Hispanic and Native Indian third world peoples will remain in an oppressive stranglehold for eternity. Carter promoted the destruction of schools and universities in El Salvador and relegated free speech and expression to the grave in this great land. Additionally, the independent Salvadoran media was targeted by the racist butcher Jimmy Carter. Carter was also responsible for the colonial white dictatorial regime of Guatemala, which committed 99% of the atrocities using American genocidal hardware. Cruel, sadistic torture terror techniques against the great Hispanic and Native Indian Guatemalan people were carried out by placing them in battery acid and burning them to death in front of their families as a retributive action for existing in Guatemala. The racist, angry, white, vigilante lynch mob butchers of America denied all these crimes and stated that these were just ordinary events caused by guerrillas or right-wing extremists. Similar to their action against the great Indochinese people, the revolutionary forces in Vietnam were far less destructive than the angry white dictatorship of Ngo Dinh Diem, a ruthless butcher who used state terror to slaughter the civilian Vietnamese population, funded and lavished by the American white fraud politicians in Congress and the president, Lyndon Johnson, the sadist-in-chief, from 1963 to 1969. The population was forcibly removed and placed into concentration camps, and there was ecocide in which crops were sprayed, causing complete destruction of all forms of life in Indochina. The Vietnamese people were starved by the angry white vigilantes of Washington, who found that by causing destruction of the land, that they could create a state of sheer violence that could then lead them to not be the aggressor and feel morally justified as mass murderers. The moral justification is rather humorous in light of Washington's records on morality, in which the great third world peoples of Indochina were genocided by American weapons, troops including torture squads and death squads, and were lavishly funded by the racist whites of Washington. In March 1980, Duarte of El Salvador conducted a war of extermination and genocide against the great Hispanic and Native Indian peoples of this land. The American white frauds of Congress over-exaggerated the guerrilla force's strength so that an unleashing of bestial American murder could be propagated against the poor people of this land. It is, as usual, an example of the bestial, savage American whites of Washington. As Dr. Chomsky states, the suffering of the third world peoples is due to the racist, jealous hate of the white congressional politicians and president of America. They have delusions of third world health and wealth and follow their delusions with murderous campaigns of oppression, terror, including mutilation, burning, arm and leg amputations, spine paralysis by snapping the neck, and such vicious actions. The American government, white butchers are thugs, and when they get jealous feelings, which is 99% of the time, they seek to assuage those through murder of the great Third World Hispanic and Native Indian, Indochinese, including the great Cambodian, Vietnamese, and Laotian peoples, as well as the great peoples of Indonesia, China, and Korea. As their racist whites complain about the Asian people's theft, the criminal murder of 5 million plus Indonesians, Cambodians, Vietnamese, and Laotians remains hidden. And because if we hide it, our racist brothers in Europe won't know that we murdered and we would be able to break European laws. So we can't lynch the Asians or Hispanic peoples anymore. We have to just pretend that we never, ever hurt them. Like a sadistic, detached, bestial American savage government, genocidal, anti-third world, anti-ethnic butcher. So basically, that's maybe my background. Ultimately my background. So I will begin the presentation. I'm going to go through the book. Just give me 1 second. Going to see if I can fix the lighting here. I think that's a little better. So let's get started here. The title of the chapter is The Fifth Freedom. The Times reporter William Krem described the failed coup attempt he had just witnessed in El Salvador. The people here drank their sedition directly from slogans of the United Nations. It was possible for the Diario Latino to conduct an anti-Martinez campaign for a whole year merely by featuring phrases of Roosevelt and Churchill on the four freedoms. Perhaps naively, they believed them. They were convinced that by its utterances, the United States would not look unkindly on their efforts to unfurl the Atlantic Charter on this bit of Pacific coast. Their leaders botched matters, and the first thing they knew, the embassy doors were slammed and their forces when they sought asylum from their hangmen. The Time reports elicited a response from the State Department, which, in Krem's words, explained that asylum might be extended to those threatened by mob violence, but never anybody pursued by the constituted authorities. In less stuffy language, a dictator fleeing the retribution of his people would find embassy doors ajar, but for Democrats hunted by the dictator's goons, they would be bolted. It was an elucidation that could not fail to impress the Salvadoran public. The coup attempt by military affairs with middle-class backing aimed to depose General Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, who ruled El Salvador since 1931. One of a group of Central American dictators supported by the United States. Martinez had won notoriety by presiding over the 1932 Matanza massacre, a slaughter of some 10 to 30,000 peasants, while the U.S. and Canadian naval vessels stood offshore and U.S. Marines were alerted in Nicaragua. It was found unnecessary for the United States forces and British forces to land. U.S. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral William V. Pratt testified before Congress as the Salvadoran government had the situation in hand. Martinez was granted informal recognition at once on the grounds of his success in having put down the recent disorders. State Department with full recognition following in 1934 in defiance of an agreement with the Central American states that military dictators were not to be recognized without free elections. The latter condition was presumably satisfied the next year when Martinez was elected, unopposed after having been eliminated or suppressed any political opposition. Martinez maintained his rule until 1944, with bloody repression and corruption while openly aiding with European and Japanese fascism through the 1930s, and in limited ways introducing some social reforms in the style of Hispanic fascist models. Thus, a government housing program constructed 3,000 houses from 1932 to 1942, while the population of San Salvador alone increased to 80,000, and 0.25% of the population received land, including squatters, required to pay for the land on which they lived or be expelled in a land reform program. There was little support for the 1944 coup attempt by labor, the peasantry, or the urban poor who had been traumatized by the Matanza. All of this was during the peak years of the good neighbor policy, which was to replace the earlier rampant U.S. military interventionism. It exalted rhetoric, concealed something rather different. The lessons taught once again by these events have been learned and relearned throughout Central America, and not only learned and relearned throughout Central America for many years. U.S. rhetoric is often noble and inspiring, while operative policy in the real world follows its own quite different course, readily discernible in the actual history and rooted in institutional structures that change very slowly, if at all, and often outlined frankly in internal documents. We understand such facts with regard to official enemies. The rhetoric of Soviet propaganda is also elevated, and the developments in Eastern Europe vary under the influence of local particularities and historical contingencies. But it would be absurd to ignore their systematic pattern and its roots in the institutions and planning of the regional superpower. In fact, we learn a good deal about the USSR by observing the domains of its authority and control. Much the same is true of the United States. The history of Central America and the Caribbean in the shadow of an emerging superpower is particularly enlightening in this regard, as noted earlier. The rhetorical flourishes of political leaders, which resound through the ideological institution, play their assigned roles in concealing the evolving reality from the domestic population of the hegemonic power, who would be unlikely to tolerate the truth with equanimity. The rhetoric, however fanciful, may be sincerely believed by the purveyors of propaganda, in public as in personal life. It is easy to come to believe what is convenient to believe. As John Adams once said, power always thinks it has a great soul and vast views beyond the comprehension of the weak, and that is doing God service when it is violating all his laws. The Four Freedoms and the Atlantic Charter illustrate very well the true significance of domestic utility and noble ideals. President Roosevelt announced in January 1941 that the Allies were fighting for freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. The terms of the Atlantic Charter signed by the Roosevelt and Churchill the following August were no less elevated. These lofty sentiments helped to maintain domestic cohesion during the difficult war years and were taken seriously by oppressed and suffering people elsewhere who were soon to be disabused of their illusions. It was not the first nor last time the Truman Doctrine rhetoric in 1947 about supporting free peoples who are restricting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure, concealed plans for counterinsurgency in Greece, soon implemented, which led to an unspeakable carnage and terror. Meanwhile, perennial presidential advisor Clark Clifford happily observed that the doctrine served as the opening gun in a campaign to bring people up to the realization that the war isn't over by any means, setting off a new era of domestic militarism and intervention abroad in the context of Cold War confrontation. The true meaning of Jimmy Carter's soulful devotion to human rights would be learned by hundreds and thousands of victims of torture, starvation, and outright slaughter in El Salvador, Timor, Laos, and elsewhere. So both all El Salvador, Timor, Laos, and elsewhere. John F. Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, launched with great fanfare out of fear for the Cuban model might inspire others to pursue the same course, was again rhetorical triumph. Its real-world impact for 1960 to 1965 was summarized by the Inter-American Economic Affairs During that period of distribution of income became even more unsatisfactory as the gap between the rich and poor widened appreciably. During most of the period, a very heavy proportion of the disbursements went to military regimes which had overthrown constitutional governments. And at the end of the period, with almost half of the population under military rule, a significant portion of the aid was going not to assist free men and free governments, it's in alliance rhetoric, but rather to hold the power regimes in which the people had lost their freedom. So I'm going to just interject here for a second. So the true meaning of Jimmy Carter's soulful devotion to human rights would be learned by hundreds of thousands of victims of torture, starvation, and outright slaughter to El Salvador, Timor, Laos, and elsewhere. So you can see the US government, the racist frauds of America, the white, angry, vigilante, lynch mob whites, allowed Jimmy Carter to torture and then called him a human rights president. That's what Washington does. Washington needs to explain these things. You know, Congress and president, this is not really appropriate. This is, we are asking you, where is the murder campaign, the throwing infants against rocks, the cutting off of their arms, the amputations that you will hear about subsequently in this book? Where are all those things in your concept of human rights? You are simply racist American, white, genocidal, bestial butchers. Continuing on. These consequences were the direct and predictable results of fateful decisions of the Kennedy administration, to which we return. Meanwhile, alliance funds in massive amounts went to U.S.-owned firms and to Central American oligarchs that controlled banks and mercantile businesses, as well as the best tillable land. U.S. investment rose rapidly, and while the first decade did record statistical growth of their economies, its effect was to shift subsistence production to export crops for the benefit of foreign corporations and local oligarchs, while every country of Central America increasingly lost the capacity to feed itself, and starvation and misery grew. Again, the result of specific decisions of Washington with predictable consequences. The substantial growth of military forces trained for internal repression was a natural concomitant of the Alliance for Progress, which helped make such a force necessary as the expansion of the export economy took lands from campesinos and set the class war in motion. Few statesmen were more given to uplifting pronouncement about the rights of the weak and oppressed than Woodrow Wilson, the greatest interventionist of all, quote unquote, who celebrated the doctrine of self-determination by invading viciously Mexico, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. One supplicant approached Wilson's Paris residence during the Versailles Conference in 1918 hoping to present a petition entreating the victorious allies to support his country's permanent representation in the French Parliament by elected natives in order to keep it informed of the native aspirations. But it went in vain. The appeal went undelivered. United States Marines guarding President Wilson in his quarters chased the would-be petitioner away like a pest, an important phrase in the education of the man later known as Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese revolutionary. The noble rhetoric remains unsullied by Western discourse, including much scholarship. But many poor and suffering people have much clearer understanding of the reality. It is always mass. So you can see Woodrow Wilson, the angry, racist, white, pro-Ku Klux Klan of the American government, the president who supported the Ku Klux Klan in the White House and watched the birth of the nation publicly on its films, didn't even listen to Ho Chi Minh. This, butcher warrior of white supremacy, mass murdered the Haitian people. He mass murdered the Mexican people. And he mass murdered the Dominican people in a vicious, racist foray. In the privileged countries of the West, there have been a few who have refrained from joining the celebrations of the true believers. The revolutionary pacifist A.J. Must once quoted this remark, thinking no doubt of World War II. The problem after war is with the victor. He thinks he has just proved that war and violence pay. Who will now teach him a lesson? The sentiment was to the point as post-war events believed. The perceptions of the planners. In the chambers of power, a clearer vision is also sometimes expressed. In the mid-1941, while school children were memorizing their 4 freedoms, and soon after the Atlantic Charter, the War and Peace Studies project of the Council of Foreign Relations, which included top government planners and members of the foreign policy elite with close links to government and corporations, explained privately that formulation of a statement of war aims for propaganda purposes is very different from formulation one defining the true national interest, recommending further that if war aims are stated, which seems to be concerned solely with Anglo-American imperialism, they will offer little to people in the rest of the world and will be vulnerable to Nazi counterpromises. Such aims would also strengthen the most reactionary elements in the United States and the British Empire. The interests of other peoples should be stressed, not only those of Europe, but also of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This would have a better propaganda effect. In accordance with this conception, Roosevelt spoke of 4 freedoms, but not of the 5th freedom, and most important, the freedom to rob and exploit. Infringement of the 4 official freedoms in enemy territory always evokes much agonized concern. Not, however, in our own ample domains. Here, as the historical record demonstrates with great clarity, it is only when the 5th and fundamental freedom is threatened that a sudden and short-lived concern for the other forms of freedom manifests itself, to be sustained for as long as it is needed to justify the righteous use of force and violence to restore the 5th freedom, the one that really counts. A careful look at the history and the internal record of planning reveals a guiding geopolitical conception, preservation of the 5th freedom by whatever means are feasible. Much of what U.S. governments do in the world can be readily understood in terms of this principle, while if it remains obscured, acts and events will appear incomprehensible. The maze of confusion, random error, and accident. Many other factors also operate, fortunately, or there would be no hope of modifying state policies and actions short of social revolution. But this principle is an invariant core, deeply rooted in the basic institutions of American society. Public discussion of the facts would plainly not have a good propaganda effect. So the ideologic institutions, the schools, university, and media, and much of American scholarship keep to a familiar refrain, extolling our profound concern for human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization. In private, the more intelligent planners reveal that they labor under few illusions and urge that we not be hampered by idealistic slogans, quote unquote, of this sort. The central point was lucidly explained in an internal document written in 1948 by George Kennan, head of the State Department planning staff in early post-war World War II period. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. We should cease to talk about vague and, for the Far East, unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democracy. The day is not far off when we are going to have to deal with in straight power concepts. The less we are hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. So you can see George Kennan, the State Department planning staff chief in 1948, has revealed the truth of U.S. foreign policy for, even until today. Until today, their policy is we should cease to talk about vague ideas of democracy, human rights, and raising the living standard for poor people. they do the same thing. That's their action. They're, racist, angry frauds that, outwardly say human rights is important while they conduct campaigns, especially in the Far East. He alludes very clearly to the Far East, but it also exists in Latin America, where their campaigns are fascism and, fascism, as well as, mass murder, torture, right? Human rights of amputations is what the U.S. government does. Banging babies on rocks, human rights. Cracking people's spine, calling the mafia or the U.S. military one and the same to break the people's bones in the third world. That's their human rights. To crack their spine, paralyze them, or cut their arms off. That's the ideals of human rights for the United States. But, publicly we state that, we're human rights champions. But when in truth, we throw democracy into the trash. We support fascism, and we support, cutting people's arms off and decapitating them when we feel obliged. So continuing on, the prescription is noteworthy not only for the clarity and forthrightness, but also of its source. One of the most thoughtful and humane of U.S. planners, who left his position not long after because he was considered not sufficiently tough-minded for this harsh world. Note that this is a top-secret document. The idealistic slogans must constantly be trumpeted in public in order to pacify the domestic population, as in the 1984 report of the bipartisan Kissinger Commission, which opens by explaining that the international purposes of the United States in the late 20th centuries are cooperation, not hegemony or domination partnership, not confrontation, a decent life for all, not exploitation. The historical and contemporary record reveals just how seriously these fine words are to be taken. This is, to be sure, an exception to Keenan's advice, explained by the Joint Strategic Survey Committee in a top-secret discussion with U.S. assistance in other countries a few months earlier. This report stipulates that assistance should be concentrated on those countries of primary strategic importance to the United States in cases of ideologic warfare, excepting in those rare instances which present an opportunity for the United States to gain worldwide approbation by an act strikingly humanitarian in such a case. We may briefly live up to the inspiring ideals. Etzold and Gaddis observed that ranking of interest in this document to a large extent established priorities for the programs of economic and military assistance implemented in the name of containment during the next 3 years. So I'm going to take a short break. We have, it isn't a very long chapter actually, but there is a good duration, so it's about another 30 pages. So I'm going to take a short break. I'll be right back, and as soon as I come back, we'll continue. Just 1 minute. Okay, we're going to start in just a minute. I'm just going to continue. Cannon's prescriptions refer to the Far East, but the U.S. is a global power, and this general geopolitical conception, amply illustrated over many years, is applicable elsewhere as well, as Kennan, among others, made clear. Before considering its more general application, we might observe that some question can be raised about Kennan's formulation of the goals of national policy. One has to do with his concept of the disparity between us and them. Ignored here are certain disparities among us. In fact, planners recognized early on that more egalitarian social arrangement at home might reduce the need to protect the fifth freedom abroad. One participant in the War and Peace Studies project observed that the domains of U.S. control must be sufficient to provide it with the elbow room needed in order to survive without major readjustments. It was understood that changes in the domestic distribution of power, wealth, ownership, and control might reduce the significance of the fifth freedom for the American economy. Furthermore, the harsh measures required to maintain the somewhat abstract disparity between us and them carry severe costs, both material and moral. Perhaps in the present narrow context, the latter should be put aside as irrelevant sentimentality. But it is far from clear that we benefit materially from the national commitment to maintain this position of disparity by force, a commitment that entails global confrontation with the constant threat of nuclear war, an economy driven by military production, loss of jobs to regions where U.S.-supported thugs ensure low wages and miserable living standards, almost 60,000 soldiers killed in an attempt to enforce our will in Indochina, and so on and so on. The idea that we confront them is a staple of the ideological system, one that has as much merit as the tenets of other religious cults. With this cautionary note, I will nevertheless continue to use these misleading formulations, thus adopting with some misgivings one of the conventional devices employed to prevent understanding of the world in which we live. A second question is whether Kennan is correct in suggesting that, quote, human rights, the raising of living standards and democratization should be dismissed as irrelevant to American foreign policy, except when points can be scored in ideologic warfare. A review of the historical record suggests a different picture, that U.S. policy has not been neutral in these regards, but has sought to destroy human rights, to lower the living standards, and force fascism and prevent democracy, often with considerable passion and violence. These reasons are not difficult to discern. Commitment to these values is often at odds with the fifth freedom. Preservation of the fifth freedom, that is the freedom to rob and exploit, quite regularly requires measures that tend to harm human rights and living standards. And with meaningful steps toward democracy, governments will tend to be more responsive to domestic needs, thus threatening our control of the human and material resources of the land that must be at our command if we are to maintain the disparity. We therefore quite regularly oppose human rights and raising of the living standards in practice, and we oppose meaningful democracy in much of the world to ensure that the fifth freedom to rob and exploit will not be threatened. We return in Chapter 3, Section 8, to a closer look at these specific issues. In Chapter 1, we took note of the means to which we habitually resort when the fifth freedom is challenged. Chapter 3 will be devoted to a more detailed examination of the facts of the matter, which can hardly be comforting to a person of any honesty and integrity. Kennan extended the same thinking to the Western Hemisphere in a briefing for Latin American ambassadors in 1950. He observed that a major concern of American foreign policy must be the protection of our raw materials. In fact, more broadly, the material and human resources that are ours by right. To protect our resources, we must combat a dangerous hearsay which, as U.S. intelligence noted, had been spreading through Latin America for many years. The wide acceptance of the idea that the government has direct responsibility for the welfare of the people, what is called communism, whatever the political commitments of its advocates in U.S. political theology. From whom must we protect our raw materials, ? For the public, throughout our history, we must be defending ourselves from one or another evil empire, currently from Russia. In the real world, the enemy of the indigenous population, which may attempt to use domestic resources for their own purposes, thus joining what the president called the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy to thwart American ends, President Kennedy in this case. Those who undertake this course may not be Soviet allies to begin with. In Latin America, they may have commonly been church-based self-help groups, advocates of capitalist democracy such as Juan Jose Arevalo and Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, popular organizations of the most defended by the martyred Archbishop Romero in El Salvador, and so on. But they are likely to become Soviet clients for the simple reasons that they will nowhere else turn for our protection against the violence that we regularly unleash against them. This is a net gain for American policy, since it justifies the attacks we must carry out to destroy the conspiracy to steal our resources. When the fifth freedom to rob and exploit is threatened in its domain, the U.S. regularly resorts to subversion, terror, or direct aggression to restore it, declaring the target of these actions a Russian client and acting to make this required truth a reality. The Indochina Wars are enlightening in this regard. By the late 1940s, the U.S. had committed itself to support the French efforts to reconquer their former colonies, Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Having rejected repeated overtures from the Viet Minh, the anti-French resistance, whom the State Department recognized in secret to be the representatives of the Vietnamese nationalists and people. A favorable response might have permitted the communist-led national movement to maintain its independence, thus undermining the official rationale for the U.S.-French attack. U.S. intelligence was then assigned the task of demonstrating the required truth, that Vietnamese nationalists were simply agents of the commie-dominated bloc of slave states, in Dean Aikeson's elegant phrase. Intelligence sought desperately to find links between Ho Chi Minh and the masters in the Kremlin or Peking. Either would do. It failed. State Department intelligence found evidence of Kremlin-directed conspiracy in virtually all countries except Vietnam, which appeared to be an anomaly, and found surprisingly little direct cooperation between local Chinese communists and the Viet Minh. The problem then was to show how these facts demonstrated the required conclusion that Ho was an agent of the commie conspiracy. So you can see, the freedom to rob and exploit, that is the freedom that needs to be preserved over and above all other freedoms. So the freedom, what we say human rights, the word human rights, basically, direct terror is human rights for America. Human rights is, human rights for whites. Okay, ultimately, it's human rights for white Americans. There are no other human rights by the American government's terms. They resort to subversion, direct aggression, and declaring the targets of the countries a Russian client state or some sort of evil enemy that which they need to murder and torture. So human rights is basically just a word for the American government when they require the freedom to rob and exploit, the fifth freedom, to be penultimate freedom, and all of the democracy, the rights, like the raising of living standard, all of that stuff is simply, for whites. That is a white freedom. That is not allowed for third world peoples. They're racist, anti-ethnic, bestial American white savages. Continuing on, the problem was readily solved. Perhaps a special dispensation for the Vietnamese government has been arranged in Moscow, presumably because Ho was such a loyal slave of his masters that they did not even have to provide guidance. Later, a national intelligence estimate had noted that we are unable to determine whether Peking or Moscow has ultimate responsibility for the Viet Minh policy. It is axiomatic that it must be the one or the other. One of the most astonishing revelations of the Pentagon Papers is that a record of over 2 decades, the analysis were able to discover only one staff paper which treats communist reactions primarily in terms of separate national interests of Hanoi, Moscow, and Peking, rather than primarily in terms of an overall communist strategy for which Hanoi is acting as an agent. Even U.S. intelligence, which is paid to get the facts straight, not to rave about the commie-dominated bloc of slave states, was unable to perceive the possibility that the Vietnamese communists might be guided, even in part, by their own interests and concerns, rather than merely acting as agents of their foreign masters. The higher truths of the state religion, which blinded intelligence to the most elementary facts, also pervade the mainstream scholarly literature, where we find as a point the doctrine that Vietnamese communists were inflamed by Stalin after World War II, Walt Rostow, and that U.S. intervention was aimed at forestalling a southward expansion of Chinese communism or nationalism. John King Fairbrand, an analytical error, this distinguished historian and critic of the war, believed these acts. In the real world, the Vietnamese communists did not need Stalin to inflame them. French tyranny and American racist subversion and aggression suffered. And it was clear enough early on that far from being an agency of Chinese expansionism, Vietnamese nationalism, whether communist or not, would be an obstacle to it. The role of Stalin and Mao in the U.S. doctrinal system was to legitimate the U.S. racist assaults motivated on quite different grounds, as internal documents make clear. When the attempt to subdue South Vietnam failed, the U.S. widened the war to all of Indochina in a manner that predictably led to the eventual North Vietnamese dominance after desperately blocking efforts on all sides to neutralize South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. After failing in its larger aims, the U.S. devoted itself to maximizing suffering and repression of the societies that it destroyed and helping to drive them more firmly into the hands of the USSR by systematically closing off all other options insofar as possible. Much of the same was true as the U.S. sought to overcome the heresy of capitalist democracy in Guatemala, which threatened the interests of U.S. corporations. Guatemala was declared an agency of the global communist conspiracy, and serious threats were mounted against it, including even the dispatch of nuclear-armed SAC bombers to Nicaragua, meant it would appear as a signal of American commitment. When in desperation, the Guatemalan government sought military aid from the Soviet bloc, much to the delight of the U.S. government. This fact was used as part of the official justification for restoring a military right-wing racist dictatorship. Shortly before the CIA coup, Guatemalan Foreign Minister Torriella commented accurately that U.S. policy amounts to cataloging as communism every manifestation of nationalism, self-enlightenment, or economic independence, any desire for social progress, any intellectual curiosity or democratic thought, any interest in progressive or liberal reforms, any Latin American government that exerts itself to bring about a truly national program which affects the interests of the powerful foreign companies in whose hands the wealth and the basic resources in large part repose in Latin America will be pointed out as communist. It will be accused of being a threat to continental security and making a breach in continental solidarity, and so will be threatened with foreign intervention. Torriella's words were applauded by his Latin American colleagues, who then proceeded to line up against him in support of John Foster Dulles' resolution opposing the threat of international communism in Guatemala, issued by Caracas, the capital of one of the most notorious dictatorships in the continent, in the hope of receiving U.S. aid. So you can see the U.S. government, communism, what is communism? Any colored person that tries to create sovereignty for themselves, that is what communism is. Any desire for social progress, any intellectual curiosity or democracy, any interest in progressive or liberal reforms, any economic independence, or any manifestation of nationalism. So the U.S. government clearly wants slaves. They want slaves, slavery across the world, third world slavery. The great Hispanic, the great Latin American, the great Indian, the great Asian, and the great African peoples, they want them as slaves. That is what America, the white, angry, vigilante, bestial butchers of the American government desire from world populations. We might note that the dual Latin American reaction to Torriello's words has been duplicated more than once. A UN correspondent, Louis Wisnitzer, commenting on how the United States standing in Latin America has reached an all-time low because of U.S. actions against Nicaragua, and observes that one sign of Latin American feelings towards the U.S. was a cool reception. Vice President George Bush and Secretary of State George Shultz received when they appeared at the inauguration of the new Brazilian president. They are not personally unpopular in Latin America, he notes. Yet at this reception, they were booed, while Nicaragua's President Daniel Ortega was applauded, in fact, generally unreported in the United States. 2 months earlier, ABC reported that on a visit to Uruguay, Ortega was greeted by wildly enthusiastic crowds, cheering his name as if he was about to be named president of Uruguay, a fact generally ignored in the American press. But few Latin Americans will risk offending the hemisphere's big brother when the chips are down. Returning to Guatemala, it is relevant that whatever the facts, Guatemala has been an agency of the commie conspiracy so as to justify the U.S. overthrow of its democratic government, motivated on quite different grounds. The characteristic device of U.S. foreign policy is now being employed in the familiar manner in Nicaragua, where the Reagan administration is attempting to drive the Sandinista regime securely into the hands of the evil empire, just as it is acting to undermine the private sector through embargo, so as to create the totalitarian state that is required for the U.S. to justify its violence to the distress of the business groups and conservative Nicaraguan church hierarchy that we purport to favor. Harvard Business School professor James Austin describes the embargo as a flagrant violation of international agreements and also an affront to the basic values of our society, and a foreign policy blunder that is counterproductive because it drives Nicaragua towards dependence on the Soviet Union. The first point is correct. The second reflects a serious misunderstanding, both of basic values in our society, as they are expressed in historical practice, and the goals of the American racist policy. Austin observes that the boycott violates the GATT agreements on trade as well as treaties between Nicaragua and the U.S. It expresses the position that other countries should adhere to the agreements, laws, and treaties, but the United States need not agree. True, but quite consistent with our historical practice, he quotes an outraged and bewildered marketing manager who explained, "This is the most absurd thing the United States has done, because it mostly is hurting its private sector." And he observes that it has been criticized by the U.S. finance rightist press, La Prensa. Austin comments accurately that the effect will be similar to the Cuban boycott, which increased Cuban dependency on the USSR, concluding that the president has failed to learn from history. But U.S. planners understand all of this well enough and are following a rational course in their own terms with ample historical precedent, fully expecting the consequence that Austin deplores and recognizing that these consequences will be readily exploited to justify the attacks against Nicaragua in defense of the fifth freedom for America's racist whites to rob and exploit. There is nothing absurd about this, though it does stand with the moral repulsiveness of providing aid to the Contras, as Austin states. He particularly deplores the fact that the embargo will undermine the U.S.-made potable water system in Nicaraguan hospitals, which rely on U.S. equipment, all inhumane and morally reprehensible, but fully in accord with our operative values throughout our history. To ensure that Nicaragua will become part of the commie-dominated bloc of slave states, the U.S. has been waging a proxy war of mounting intensity against Nicaragua while blocking any source of arms from other than the preferred source, the USSR and its client states. This serves a dual purpose: to maintain a level of destruction and terror in Nicaragua sufficient to reduce the danger of constructive developments in Nicaragua, and to justify the efforts on the grounds of self-defense against the evil empire. In March 1983, Undersecretary of Defense Fred Eakley testified before Congress that the USSR has provided $440 million in aid to Nicaragua since revolution, while expressing irritation that nearly 4 times that much, some $1.6 billion, had come from the non-Soviet sources, mostly what he called misguided European governments. The U.S. has predictably devoted itself to terminating this pluralism and ensuring sole dependency on the evil empire. In 1982, the French sold Nicaragua about $17 million worth of arms before U.S. anger made them steer clear of sending any more military items into the area. The press reports the statement is only partially true, since France, which will gladly sell arms to the devil himself unless prevented by higher authority, may continue to provide state terrorists in El Salvador and Guatemala with the required means of destruction with our full acquiescence. But only the Soviet Union is permitted to provide Nicaragua with arms for self-defense against our attack. When arms do not flow at the appointed level from our favorite source, U.S. propaganda lies and invents the required facts, as in the case of Guatemala in 1954, or the guerrillas in El Salvador during the Reagan years. Much of the same was true of Maoist China, in Castro's client, Cuba, among other examples. In the former case, the U.S. not only helped to create a Sino-Soviet bloc that was not inevitable, given long-standing conflicts between the Chinese communists and the USSR that extend back to the Chinese Civil War, but even instead with some passion that the Sino-Soviet bloc remained solid when it was evident to any rational observer that it was riven by deep conflicts. The important point is that such behavior is systematic and quite rational by the United States, given the guiding geopolitical conceptions which are essentially invariant, since they are rooted in the unchanging institutional structures of ownership and domination in our own society. It is commonly remarked that indigenous factors have played a role in driving the various enemies of the Fifth Freedom into the hands of the Russians. That is true, but not pertinent here. The point is that for quite understandable reasons, U.S. policy has regularly labored to reinforce precisely those tendencies and to block alternatives. Nevertheless, tactical considerations may on occasion dictate a different course, as when Nixon and Kissinger finally recognized that the Sino-Soviet bloc was unresurrectable and decided rationally to exploit the conflict and to accept Chinese overtures, hoping ultimately to draw China into the U.S.-dominated sphere and convert it into what we called a more open, quote-unquote, society, one open to U.S. economic penetration and U.S. political exploitation and control. In an important study of the Guatemalan intervention, Richard Immerman argues that top U.S. planners and corporate representatives closely linked to government or running it really believed that Guatemala's moderate reforms constituted prima facie evidence of the penetration of Central America by a frankly Russian-dominated communist group, Adolphe Berle, on behalf of the Council of Foreign Relations to the U.S. State Department, thus justifying U.S. intervention in defense of freedom. He may well be right, but the point is of little significance for rather boring study of the psychology of leaders and ideologues. It is a rare individual who consciously believes that what he or she does is genuinely evil. As noted earlier, it is easy enough to come to believe whatever is convenient. There is no reason to doubt the sincerity of Japanese fascists when explained that they were creating an earthly paradise as they swept across China 50 years ago, not for crass economic motives. Japan was, after all, spending more than it could hope to gain in protecting the true nationalists under its wings from bandits such as Chiang Kai-shek, but to bring the benefits of civilization to benighted and oppressed peoples who had been victims of Western imperialism. Similarly, Hitler doubtless sincerely wanted peace on his terms, and the integrity and vitality of the German nation, as he proclaimed, and Soviet leaders yearned for stability and economic development in Eastern Europe and Afghanistan. We should have no difficulty in understanding their self-image and picture of the world if we can look honestly at ourselves. Not only state planners, but the educated classes generally are given to sincere belief in the most astonishing and self-serving fantasies, a fact of little relevance to the study of policy formation. In the case of official enemies or precursors in imperial aggression, we will readily understand that true interests are disguised in propaganda, perhaps even disguised to those who propound it. Only in studying the record of our own state is such elementary rationality prescribed. There is, however, a related point that is of some significance for the study of state policy. A system of rationalizations and propaganda lies, once constructed and internalized, may come to be a factor influencing policy decisions as ideology overwhelms interests. The same may be true of other irrational factors. For example, heroic posturing and the like. A close analysis of policy will generally unearth a structure of rational calculation based on perceived and political planning. Many other elements may also intervene, sometimes significantly, including the system of self-serving beliefs that is regularly constructed and disguised to others and to oneself what is really happening in the world. So we can review the last couple pages. It's basically that, we basically fantasize, like the U.S. government, the white, angry, bestial, racist butchers of America, they fantasize when they, think that there is evil. They fantasize. They think that, they're doing the right thing for the people when they slaughter them, when they throw the infants against the rocks, when they cut the arms of the men and women and children off, when they gang rape the women in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, when they torture and, cut the arms and ears off the infants and children in Guatemala and El Salvador and Nicaragua. They feel that, they're doing the right thing. That's the way the U.S. government, the angry, bestial, racist, savage whites of Washington. Failure to understand the roots of U.S. foreign policy and a curious unwillingness to perceive its highly systematic nature over the many years makes it appear that this policy is confused and is failing when it is succeeding brilliantly. Thus, conservative British correspondent Timothy Garton Ash finds a striking inconsistency in the way U.S. has pursued its principles in Central America, Nicaragua being a prime example. The inconsistency is that the U.S. is devoted to pluralism, respect for human rights, and other good things, and to persuading the Sandinistas to cut their ties with the USSR. But the contra-aggression, quote unquote, sponsored by the United States has precisely the opposite effect, increasing internal repression, undermining advocates of a third way like President Daniel Ortega, applying arguments of the Leninists, increasing the militarization of the country and strengthening its ties to the USSR. The situation, he states, is comparable to that of Cuba 20 years ago. The inconsistency arises only if we assume that official U.S. pronouncements aimed at the general public are necessary truths. If we subject them to the test of history, as in the case states that do not merit such loyalty and adulation, we will discover, not surprisingly, that they are without merit and that the inconsistency disappears. Refusing to accept elementary canons of rationality, we will fail to comprehend that the consequences Ash perceives are precisely the intent of U.S. policy to ensure that constructive developments in Nicaragua will not infect the region, and to strengthen its ties with the USSR to justify our assault against those who violate the fifth freedom to rob and exploit the third world. The behavior of the U.S. government over many years will appear to yield further inconsistencies, curiously systematic ones, as anyone whose eyes are open will quickly discover. Ash finds the inconsistency puzzling because he credits childish inanities about the U.S. dedication to the liberal creed and dedication to a value system, virtually alone among nations, citing Michael Howard, Regis Professor of Modern History of Oxford, Putting these delusions aside, a rational pattern emerges, and a highly familiar one. One might note incidentally the remarkable colonization of sophisticated British intellectuals who regard themselves as independent and critical, but in fact react to US power and propaganda in a manner reminiscent of some of the more absurd Anglophile Indian intellectuals under the empire. It is particularly important for people who hope to influence government policy to be clear about these matters. There is no point in wasting time in patiently explaining to our leaders that the policies they pursue are inconsistent with the goals that they profess. They know this well enough without our help, nor is there any reason to suppose that a different group of leaders of America would react in any essentially different way to the same institutional imperatives. It is not failure to understand a simple point so clear to us that regularly leads to the political leadership to commit the same error over and over and over again. Returning to Kennan's prescription, what means we must use against our enemies who fall prey to the heresy that threatens our resources. Kennan explains the same briefing to the ambassadors. The final answer might be an unpleasant one, but we should not hesitate before police repression by the local government. This is not shameful, since the communists are essentially traitors. It is better to have a strong regime in power than a liberal government if it is indulgent and relaxed and penetrated by communists. Again, as policy becomes practice, the term communist takes on a technical sense in American political discourse, referring to the third world people who do not appreciate the sanctity of the fifth freedom to rob and exploit people of the third world. It is a small wonder, then, that John F. Kennedy should have held that governments in the civil military type of El Salvador are the most effective in containing communist penetration in Latin America. This was after a military coup overthrew a liberal civilian government with U.S. approval, while the Kennedy administration was organizing the basic structure of the military and paramilitary death squads that have massacred tens of thousands of civilians since within the framework of the Alliance for Progress. In fact, the most lasting effect of that program, apart from its contributions to dependent development in the U.S. interest. The concept of communism was further elaborated by a prestigious study group of the National Planning Association and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, headed by William Yandell Elliott of Harvard. In 1955, the study quoted accurately that the primary threat of what they called communism is the economic transformation of the communist powers in ways which reduce their willingness and ability to complement the industrial economies of the West. This insightful comment provides a good operational definition of the term communist as it is used in American political discourse. If a government or popular movement is so evil as to undertake a course of action of this sort, it at once becomes an enemy. It has joined the monoliths and ruthless conspiracy to steal what is ours, namely their resources, and by definition, it has been taken over by the Russians, and we will act to ensure that it is so, that we may legitimately proceed to terminate this scandal by subversion or intervention, all of which the noblest intent and in the defense of the highest values. In other words, as the Argentine and Mexican writer Gregorio Salzer explains with a somewhat clearer vision, the North American Puritans meekly sacrificed themselves to care for the flock, gobbling any willful lamb that proved intractable to their protection. So I'm going to take a short break. I'll be back in, maybe 15, maybe 1 minute or so. I'll be right back, and, we'll continue in just a minute. Okay, we're going to start in 1 second. I should be ready in 1 second. Okay, so this is going to be Latin America, an incident, not an end. Seltzer is, of course, not the first Latin American to discover that the United States seems destined to plague and torment the American continent in the name of quote-unquote freedom. Simon Bolivar, 1829. Nor was Keenan the first to enunciate the doctrine that the U.S. has special rights in Latin America. Thomas Jefferson declared that America has a hemisphere to itself, and John Quincy Adams, while formulating the thinking that led to the Monroe Doctrine, stated to the cabinet that the world must be familiarized with the idea of considering a proper dominion to the continent of North America. It is, he said, as much a law of nature that this should become our pretension as that the Mississippi should flow to the sea, while in his diary he recorded his statement to British Minister Canning, "Keep what is yours, but leave the rest of this continent to us." Connell Smith comments that while it is not entirely clear what Jefferson, a well-known expansionist, meant by the term America, the appropriation by United States citizens of the adjective American, not surprisingly resented by Latin Americans, has encouraged a proprietary attitude towards the Latin American hemisphere already present in 1923. This proprietary interest was expressed in the Monroe Doctrine, announced by the president in 1823. The doctrine has no more standing in international affairs than the Brezhnev Doctrine, a century and a half later, expressing the right of the USSR to protect the socialist world from influences regarded as subversive. In the major scholarly study of the Monroe Doctrine and its subsequent history, Dexter Perkins comments that the doctrine of a policy of the United States not fixed in principle in international law, a conclusion that is surely correct. Latin Americans have seen the Monroe Doctrine as an expression of the United States hegemony employed to justify that country's own intervention, not as protection against Europe, and since the days of Simon Bolivar have sought to summon Europe and their aid against the Colossus in the north, with good reason. The operative's meaning of the doctrine was lucidly explained by Woodrow Wilson, Secretary of State Robert Lansing, in what Wilson described as an unanswerable argument, one that would be impolitic to the state openly. In the advocacy of the Monroe Doctrine, the United States considers its own interests. The integrity of other American nations is an incident, not an end. While this may seem based on selfishness alone, the author of the doctrine has no higher or more generous motive in its declaration. A few years earlier, President William Howard Taft had sagely explained that the day is not far distant when the whole hemisphere will be ours, in fact, as by virtue of our superiority of white race. It is already ours morally. The attitude towards Latin Americans remains as expressed by Wilson, Secretary of State of the Interior, to Lansing. They are naughty children who are exercising all the privileges and rights of grown-ups, requiring a stiff hand, an authoritative hand, referring to the third world peoples, naughty children. The essence of doctrine and the protection it conveyed for Latin America was expressed succinctly by Secretary of State Richard only in 1895, when Great Britain was still the evil empire. Today, the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law upon the subject to which it confines its interpretation. Why? It is not because of the pure friendship or goodwill felt for it. It is not simply by reason of high character or civilized state, nor because reason, justice, or equity are the inevitable characteristics of dealings of the United States. It is because, in addition to all other grounds, its infinite resources combined with its isolated position render it master of the situation and practically invulnerable against any and all other powers. So you can see, just to shortly summarize, William Howard Taft believes that the white race is superior and that because of our race, the whole hemisphere, the whole of Latin America is ours. The third world people, we can walk over them, we can slaughter them, we can murder them. There's no problem. William Howard Taft, just pro-white supremacy, an angry vigilante, bestial, savage, white, genocidal, racist butcher. Additionally, Woodrow Wilson, another one, Woodrow Wilson or Robert Lansing, basically his Secretary of State, said that the integrity of American nations is an incident. Basically, we are allowed to do whatever we want in the Western Hemisphere. Subjugate the third world peoples, it doesn't matter. They're not peoples. We are whites and we are the people supreme. That is, Robert Lansing and Woodrow Wilson's, ideology. They are racist American, bestial white, anti-ethnic, anti-third world savages. Continuing on, much of the subsequent history of the region is elegantly summarized in these lines, as it is confidential memorandum of 1927 by Undersecretary of State Robert Olds expressing U.S. policy goals in Nicaragua as the U.S. once again sent the Marines. The Central American area down to and including the Isthmus of Panama constitutes a legitimate sphere of influence in the United States. If we are to have regard for our own safety and protection, our ministers accredited to the 5 little republics stretching from the Mexican border to Panama have been advisors whose advice has been virtually accepted as law. We do control the destinies of Central America, and we do so for the simple reason that the national interest absolutely dictates such a course. We must decide whether we shall tolerate the interference of any other power, Mexico, in Central American affairs, or insist upon our own dominant position. If this Mexican maneuver succeeds, it will take many years to recover the ground we shall have lost. Until now, Central America has always understood that governments which we recognize and support stay in power, while those which we do not recognize and support fall. Nicaragua has become the test case. It is difficult to see how we can afford to be defeated. We were not defeated and rarely are. For the people of Nicaragua, the verdict of history was quite different. Summarizing his 3-volume work, Dexter Perkins writes that in the sheer development of the Monroe Doctrine, one of the most extraordinary and interesting objects of study must be the evolution of a doctrine which was intended for the protection of Latin American states by the United States into one that justified and even sanctified American interference in and control in the affairs of the independent republics of the continent. This assessment of the early intention may be questioned, and one might slightly be taken aback by Perkins' lack of comment over what is the interference has meant in Latin America. Evident enough when he wrote in 1937, but the basic thrust of his summary is much to the point. Over the years, there have been various corollaries to the Monroe Doctrine, most notably the Roosevelt corollary announced by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1904, after he had succeeded in stealing the Panama Canal route from Colombia with an eye on the Dominican Republic. Chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society may, in America as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention of some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere, that adherence to the United States, to the Monroe Doctrine, may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, the exercise of an international police power. The pronouncement was described by the Argentine newspaper La Prensa as the most serious and menacing declaration against the South American integrity which has come out of Washington ever. For Theodore Roosevelt, Connell Smith's comment, the dominant position of the United States in the Western Hemisphere was exactly like that of the English-speaking race in South Africa. Both were in the interest of civilization of the white peoples. Colombia's not being a civilized nation, the chicanery involved in the Panama Canal robbery was entirely legitimate according to the white supremacists. The Colombians who objected to Roosevelt's maneuvers were, after all, nothing but damaged dagos, as he explained, who had to be taught the proper behavior. In the words of the American historian, Roosevelt made it clear how he would deal with refractory Latin Americans. He would show those dagos that he will have them behave decently. Woodrow Wilson took matters a step further. As a progressive, he thought a good system was one that was orderly and slightly reformed, by which he came to mean replacing European concessions with North American, and to produce what Lefebvre calls the Wilson corollary. Wilson issued a declaration extending the Monroe Doctrine to European financiers and contractors of whose acts he disapproved, that is, the European financial as well as political and military intervention. The Latin American order would rest on cooperation with those whose acts in the interest of peace and honor, who protect private rights, meaning it, in effect, the rights of U.S. businesses. A case in point was control over oil just becoming an important resource. Britain was a major threat. Wilson's State Department warned Costa Rica that department considers it most important that only approved Americans should possess oil concession in the neighborhood of the Panama Canal. Amory concessions, British supported by Costa Rica, does not appear to meet these requirements. Guatemala was thus warned that it was most important that only American oil interests received concessions, and U.S. pressure ensured that this result was achieved in the Western Hemisphere, despite some meaningless gestures designed to support the rights of U.S. access to the Middle East oil. The U.S. declared an open door, quote unquote, after all concessions were safely in U.S. hands under the Wilson Corollary. The concept of this open door, as understood in practice, is well illustrated by U.S. petroleum policy over the years. It is explained clearly that the State Department memorandum of 1944 entitled Petroleum Policy of the United States. There must be equal access for American companies everywhere, but no access for others in the Western Hemisphere, the major oil-producing region then and for over 2 decades to come, where the U.S. was safely in control. The policy was explained would involve the preservation of the absolute position presently obtaining, and therefore vigilant protection and existing concessions in United States hands, coupled with the insistence upon the open door principle of equal opportunity for the United States companies in other areas. The open door policy, quote unquote, so construed, is a corollary to the principle of the fifth freedom of the United States, the policy to rob and exploit the third world peoples. Intervention was theoretically renounced by President Hoover and Roosevelt in favor of the good neighbor policy, though the renunciation was conditional on good behavior. The Roosevelt administration relied on the threat of force to install the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba, that when it was feared that U.S. commercial interests might be threatened by the civilian government of Dr. Ramon Gros San Martin. But this was an exception. By that time, European competition, the major concern, had been effectively contained, and the U.S. reigned unchallenged, capable of attaining its objective by political economic power. Furthermore, domestic military forces trained and supplied by the U.S. could impose order and stability, that is, could guarantee the fifth freedom, without the marine dictatorships, however brutal and corrupt, were acceptable to the Hoover and Roosevelt administration as long as they satisfied this condition. By the time the good neighbor policy was officially renounced, Nicaragua was effectively controlled by the most important of these domestic guardians of order, Somoza's National Guard, while the Trujillo dictatorship of the Dominica ruled the republic through the medium of the National Guard, also established as a result of American intervention. Martinez had taken over in El Salvador after the Matanza massacre, soon to be recognized by the U.S., and most of the rest of the region was also in safe hands by 1940, as the U.S. replaced France and Britain. Meanwhile, Roosevelt created the Export-Import Bank to subsidize U.S. exports and in general acted to increase its dependency in Central American nations on the U.S. for food as they shifted export crops to the U.S. with gross long-term effects. The good neighbor policy relied on regimes which occasionally went through the forms of elections for propaganda purposes, meanwhile maintaining a status quo in which the fifth freedom was preserved, and 2% or less of the population of the 4 of the 5 Central American nations controlled the land and hence the lives of the other 98% of people. Dictatorships were thus not a paradox, but a necessity for the system, including the good neighbor policy, which carried on intervention in Central America and tightened the system far beyond anything Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson probably imagined. The good neighbor policy was summed up by journalist William Krem, who observed its effects on the spot. First, there has been intervention to impose a puppet, and then, in the name of non-intervention, propaganda lies, cash funds, and connivance keep him in the saddle. Quite generally, the state policy served to guarantee business interests. In rare conflicts between them, the state generally prevailed, a consequence to be expected. As Lefebvre aptly observes, if a system was to be maintained, the pattern is quite regular. One, the state is concerned to maintain system based on the fifth freedom and the parochial interests of particular corporations, even major ones, such as the oil companies, sometimes conflict with this end. In the case of the state, representing the long-term global interests of U.S. capitalism, generally prevails. At times, the very same individuals will reach different decisions in their institutional roles as corporate executives or state managers, not surprisingly given the different framework of planning guided by essentially the same interests. Such cases may foster a conception of independence of the state from dominant business interests, largely an illusion, though not entirely so as a close examination indicates. So you can see in summarizing, Roosevelt's statement in robbing Colombia of the Panama Canal basically said that, requires intervention by America. And in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine of imperialism may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. And La Prensa made an accurate rebuttal to the racist white president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, when they said the most serious and menacing declaration against the South American national integrity, which has come out of Washington ever. They also said William, Roosevelt, Connell Smith, another South American supporter or South American commentator, wrote, the dominant position of the United States in the Western Hemisphere was exactly like that of the English-speaking race in South Africa. Both were the interest of civilization. So you can see, Colombia was not allowed to keep the canal. The U.S. government, the white racist, apartheid type racist, Theodore Roosevelt, he, basically walked over Colombia. He just said, we're taking the canal by a racist white robber, like a robber of white racism. And in the process, he slaughtered thousands and thousands of Colombians. We know the facts. The angry white, vigilante, bestial, savage, American racist butchers. So continuing on, we're going to go on planning for global hegemony. As World War II came to an end, U.S. ideas concerning Latin America were clarified by Secretary of War Henry Stimson in a discussion on how we must eliminate and dismantle all regional systems dominated by any other power, particularly the British, while maintaining and extending our own. With regard to Latin America, he explained privately, I think that it's not asking too much to have our little region over here, namely Latin America, which never has bothered anybody. It should be noted that U.S. officials had already had a ready explanation for the distinction between control by the U.S. and other powers. As Abe Fortas explained with regard to the U.S. trusteeship plans in the Pacific, which Churchill regarded as a cover for annexation, when we take over the Marianas and fortify them, we are doing so not only on the basis of our own right to do so, but in part of our obligation to the security of the world. The reservations were being made in the interest of world security rather than that of our own security, which was good for us and good for the world. On such assumptions, naturally regarded highly by U.S. officials and ideologists, quite a range of actions become legitimate. In keeping with Stimson's conception, the Joint Chiefs of Staffs through 1945 and early 1946 insisted that non-American forces must be kept out of the Western Hemisphere, which is a distinct military entity, the integrity of which is fundamental postulate of our security in the event of another world war. In January 1947, the Secretary of War Patterson added that the resources of Latin America were essential to the U.S. because it is imperative that our war potential is enhanced during any national emergency. Patterson gave an expansive interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, consistent with the Wilson Corollary. The doctrine meant that we are not only refused to tolerate foreign colonization, control, or the extension of a foreign political system in our hemisphere, but we take alarm from the appearance on the continent of foreign ideologies, commercial exploitation, cartel arrangements, or other systems of increased non-hemispheric influence. The U.S. must have a stable, secure, and friendly flank to the south, not confused by enemy penetration, political, economic, or military. The prime concern was not the USSR, but rather Europe, including sales of arms by the British to Chile and Ecuador, to Sweden and to Argentina, and by France to Argentina and Brazil. From January 1945, military and civilian officials of the War and Navy departments argued for an extensive system of U.S. bases, curtailment of all foreign military aid and military sales, training of Latin American officers, and supply of arms in Latin America by the U.S. under a comprehensive military assistance program. While laying these plans for a little region over here, which never ever bothered anybody, the U.S. was in the mood to allow other similar rights elsewhere. Certainly was in no mood to allow the other similar rights elsewhere, certainly not the USSR. Secretary of State Burns, in fact, observed that these plans for Latin America, because it might prejudice U.S. initiatives elsewhere that he regarded as most important, in particular in Greece and Turkey, which are our outposts on the borders of the USSR, which had far more serious security concerns than the U.S. The outposts were also intended to buttress the ambitions of the crucial Middle East region with its incomparable energy reserves, then passing into American hands. Commenting on the array of material of the sort laying out U.S. plans, much of it is classified and recently released. Liffler notes that these moves were made while U.S. officials were paying lip service to the United Nations and worrying about the impact of regional agreements in the Western Hemisphere and Soviet actions and American influence in Europe. The problem was that one concerned Stimson how to extend our own regional systems while dismantling all others, particularly those of Britain and the USSR. The same problems were arising in Europe, where the USSR observed the unilateral US and British takeover in Italy, Belgium, and elsewhere, especially elsewhere, with equanimity, later using this as a model for its brutal takeover in Eastern Europe, to much outrage in the West, justified but not lacking in hypocrisy. In Chapter 4, we return to the more general concept of post-war national security, in which the plans just sketched for Latin America were a small element. The geopolitical conception that underlines Keenan's nutshell presentation of U.S. foreign policy had been elaborated during the war by the War and Peace Studies Project of the Council of Foreign Relations, whose thoughts on the suppression of war aims and on elbow room were cited earlier. These high-level sessions took place from 1939 to 1945, producing extensive plans for the post-war period. Their concern was to elaborate the requirements of the United States in a world in which it proposes to hold unquestioned power. It was clearly by the early 1940s that the U.S. would emerge from the war in a position of unparalleled dominance, initiating a period in which it would be the hegemonic power in a system of world order. In the words of an elite group 30 years later, the group developed the concept of the grand area, quote unquote, understood as the region subordinated to the needs of the U.S. economy. As one participant put it, the grand area was a region strategically necessary for the world control. A geopolitical analysis concluded that the grand area must include the Western Hemisphere, the Far East, and the former British Empire, then being dismantled and open to U.S. penetration and control. The exercise referred to as anti-imperialism in much of the literature. As the war proceeded, it became clear that Western Europe would join the Grand Area, as well as the oil-producing regions of the Middle East, where U.S. control expanded at the expense of its major rivals, France and Britain. A process continued in the post-war period. Specific plans were outlined for particular regions, and institutional structures were proposed for the Grand Area, which was regarded as a nucleus or model that could be extended optimally to a global system. It is in this context that Keenan's proposals should be understood. The memorandum of the National Security Council and other government documents in subsequent years often chose to follow the recommendations of the wartime planners, not surprisingly, since the same interests were representative, often the same people. They are also in accord with Keenan's principles. For example, NSC 48/1 in December 1948 states that while scrupulously avoiding assumptions of responsibility for raising Asiatic living standards, it is to the U.S. interest to promote the ability of these countries to maintain the economic conditions prerequisite for political stability. Thus, in accordance with Keenan's precepts, we should not be hampered by idealistic slogans about the raising of the living standard, though economic aid may be in order when we have something to gain by it. It is not, of course, proposed that we should assist or even permit the national movement of Vietnam to achieve economic health and political stability. On the contrary, a State Department policy statement of September 1948 had explained that it is an unpleasant fact that communist Ho Chi Minh is the strongest and perhaps the ablest figure in Indochina, and that any suggested solution which excludes him is an expedient of uncertain outcome, a serious problem, since plainly we must seek to exclude him in the pursuit of the fifth freedom to rob and exploit. Political stability under his leadership was not what was contemplated. Rather, stability is a code word for obedience. Those familiar with the peculiar terminology of U.S. ideologic discourse will understand that it is no contradiction when James Chase, editor of Foreign Affairs, cites our efforts to destabilize freely elected Marxist government in Chile as an illustration of the efforts of the Nixon-Kissinger realpolitik to seek stability. Destabilization in the interest of stability makes perfect sense in the age of Orwell. The problem, when noted, is placed under the rubric of irony, quote unquote, in mainstream commentary, including much scholarship. NSC 48-1 proceeds to develop the conventional explanation found in secret documents for the period of U.S. participation in the French war against Indochina, that then the U.S. takeover of that war. The reasoning, which extends directly to Latin America, merits attention. Despite references by Eisenhower and others to Vietnam's resources, Indochina was not of a major concern in itself. Rather, the importance derived from the context of the domino theory. The theory has two versions. One invoked when there is a need to frighten the public, warns that if we don't stop them there, they'll land in California and take all that we have, as expressed by President Lyndon Johnson at the height of U.S. aggression in Vietnam. There are 3 billion people in the world, and we are only 200 million of them. We outnumbered them 15-1. If might did make right, they would sweep away over the United States and take what we have. We have what we want. Quote, if we are going to have visits from any aggressors or any enemies, Johnson said in a speech in Alaska, I would rather have that aggression take place out of 10,000 miles from here than take place in Anchorage, referring to the aggression of the Vietnamese against U.S. forces in Vietnam. Therefore, as he had warned 20 years earlier, we must maintain our military strength, particularly air power. Without superior air power, America is bound and throttled giant, impotent and easy prey to any yellow dwarf with a pocket knife. So you can see Lyndon Johnson, clearly a racist, white, angry vigilante. You know, him and Congress, they were pack white animal. Wolves. They were a pack of rabid dogs of Washington, white rabid dogs of Washington, when they attacked Indochina and did all of their vicious campaigns, amputating women and children, slaughtering women and children in, numbers that, we can't even count, cutting off arms, cutting off spines, shooting them in the chest, grabbing their intestines and pulling them out. This is the angry, rabid dogs, the rabid white dogs of the United States of America. The sense that we will be a pitiful, helpless giant unless we act forthrightly in defense against the overwhelming power of our third world adversaries, in the term used by President Nixon in announcing the invasion of Cambodia, is a common refrain in U.S. political discourse, reminiscent of a rich and spoiled child who whines that he does not get everything, though to render the image more accurate, we should place a squadron of stormtroopers at the child's command. This version of the domino theory is undoubtedly believed at some level of consciousness and expresses in a vulgar way the concerns over maintaining the disparity outlined in more sophisticated terms by Keenan at the time when Lyndon Johnson was voicing his fears about the yellow dwarfs. This crude domino theory is, however, regularly dismissed but scorned if thugs go sour and policy must be reversed. But there is also a rational version of the domino theory, the operative version, which is rarely questioned and has considerable plausibility, adopting the terminology of the planners. We might call it the rotten apple theory. The rotten apple theory was outlined by Dean Acheson when he concocted a remarkable series of fabrications concerning alleged Soviet pressure on Greece, Turkey, and Iran in February 1947. In a successful effort to convince congressional leaders to support the Truman Doctrine, an incident that he cites with much pride in his memoirs. Like apples in a barrel infected by one rotten one, the corruption of Greece would infect Iran and all to the east and would carry the infection to Asia Minor, Egypt, and Africa, as well as Italy and France, which were threatened by communist participation in democratic policies. In politics, this adroit and cynical invocation of a fabricated Russian threat to prepare the way for measures to prevent infection from spreading has been imitated with great efficacy ever since. The prime concern throughout is that if there is one rotten apple in the barrel, then the rot will spread, namely the rot of successful social and economic development of the third world of a form that would constrain the fifth freedom of American whites to rob and exploit. This might have a demonstration effect. To cite another case, Kissinger aides recall that he was far more concerned over Allende in Chile than over Castro, because Allende was a living example of a democratic social reform in Latin America. And Allende's success within the democratic process might cause Latin America to become unraveled with effects as far as Europe, where Euro-communism operating within parliamentary democracy scared him no less. Allende's success would send the wrong message to Italian voters, Kissinger feared. The contagious example of Chile would infect not only Latin America, but also Southern Europe. Kissinger stated, using the conventional imagery, soon we might find that the grand area is beginning to erode. These concerns are persistent. The CIA warned in 1964 that Cuba's experiment with almost total state socialism is being watched so closely by other nations in the hemisphere, and any appearance of success there would have an extensive impact on the statist trend elsewhere in the area, to the detriment of the fifth freedom to rob and exploit. Hence, the appearance of success must be aborted by a major terrorist war, including repeated attempts to assassinate Castro, bombing of petrochemical and other installations, sinking of fishing boats, shelling of hotels, crops, and livestock, poisoning, destruction of civilian airline flights, etc. We might observe that none of this counts as terrorism by definition, since the U.S. or its associates are the perpetrators. In fact, it is a stable of Western propaganda that the communist bloc is immune to terrorist acts, sure proof that they are responsible for this scourge of modern age. Walter LaCour, for example, writes that Claire Sterling, who pioneered the concept to much acclaim, has provided ample evidence that terrorism occurs almost exclusively in democratic or relatively democratic countries. As examples of such multinational terrorism, he cites Polisario in the Western Sahara in defense of its territory counts as terrorism, since it is fighting a takeover by Morocco, a U.S. ally, and also terrorism in some Central American countries, referring to the context, makes clear to the guerrilla forces, not the state terrorism of El Salvador and Guatemala, which apparently are relatively democratic countries, according to Jimmy Carter, like Morocco, and being U.S. clients, by definition, cannot be engaged in terrorism. Similarly, the London Economist notes sagely in reviewing Sterling's terror network that no terrorist has ever attempted anything against the Soviet-controlled regimes. Many others also chimed in. And the point is now a cliche of learned discourse on the topic. In the real world, Cuba has been the major target of international terrorism, narrowly construed to exclude the U.S. proxy war against Nicaragua. Returning to the rotten apple theory, the State Department warned in 1959 that a fundamental source of danger we face in the Far East derives from Communist China's rate of economic growth, while the Joint Chiefs of Staff added that the dramatic economic improvements realized by Communist China over the past 10 years impressed the nations of the region greatly and offer a serious challenge to the free world. Similar fears were expressed concerning North Vietnam and North Korea. The conclusion drawn was that the U.S. must do what it can to retard the economic progress of communist Asian nations. The larger concern was Japan, the super domino, as John Dower called it. Japan, it was recognized, would become again the workshop of Asia, but requires access to raw materials and markets. We must therefore guarantee Japan such access so that the entire region can be incorporated within the grand area instead of developing as part of a new order with Japan as its industrial center, from where the U.S. might be extended. Concern over this project was a factor in complex interactions that led to the Japanese-American War. But it was feared social and economic development in Indochina in terms that might be meaningful to the Asian poor might cause the rot to spread through Southeast and Southeast Asia, leading Japan to associate itself with a bloc of nations independent of the grand area, or even worse, to accommodate to the Soviet bloc. A 1949 report of the State Department policy staff urged that Washington should develop an economic interdependence between Southeast Asia as a supplier of raw materials and Japan, Western Europe, and India as suppliers of finished goods, so that the region could begin to fulfill major functions as a source of raw materials and as a market for Japan and Western Europe. In this context, Vietnam gained a significance as a rotten apple that it did not have for American planners on its own. So we're going to just review. So we can see the great Latin America and Central American peoples, the great African people, and the great Asian people, the great people of the third world ethnic nations were, slaughtered at the hands of U.S. genocidal hardware, genocidal technology by the U.S. government. The rabid white dogs of Washington, the racist rabid dogs and pack of wolves of Washington, murdered in cold blood all over these regions. And unfortunately, the great third world peoples, the great South American and Central American, the great African and the great Asian peoples are not really aware of these crimes against them by the United States of America, because America, at the butt of a pistol, maintains its silence in spite of its angry white racist vigilante dogs in Washington. So continuing on, such thinking is not an original to American planners. Similar concerns have been evoked, for example, by the American Revolution. A few days before the Monroe Doctrine was announced, the Tsar of Russia warned, "Too many examples demonstrate that the contagion of revolutionary principles is arrested by neither distance nor physical obstacles. It crosses the sense, it sees, and often appears with all the symptoms of destruction which characterizes it in places where it has not only any direct contact, any relation to proximity might give ground for apprehension. France knows that what facility and to promptitude a revolution can be carried out from America to Europe." Metternich feared that the Monroe Doctrine would lend new strength to the apostles of sedition and reanimate the courage of every conspirator. If this flood of evil doctrines and pernicious examples should extend over the whole of America, what would become of our religious and political institutions, of the moral force of our governments, and of the conservative system which has saved Europe from complete dissolution? One of the Tsar's diplomats warned that we must work to prevent or defer this terrible revolution, and above all to save and fortify the portion of the Christian world which may escape the contagion and the invasion of vicious principles, namely the pernicious doctrines of republicanism and popular self-rule. The contemporary heirs of Metternich and the Tsar are animated by the similar fears and have even adopted rhetoric in Kissinger's case, perhaps with full awareness as the United States took over the role of the Tsar in the 19th century as a defender of civilization against the yellow dwarves and others who were pretensions threatened the disparity. Note incidentally that the U.S. achieved its major objectives in Indochina, it is a mistake to describe the Vietnam War simply as a U.S. defeat, as it is commonly done. The fact that became evident as the war reached its peak of violence in the late 1960s. The devastation of Indochina by United States white violence guarantees that it will not be a model for anyone for a long time to come, if ever. It will be lucky to survive. The harsh and cruel measures undertaken by the United States in the past decade are intended to ensure that this partial victory is maintained. Meanwhile, behind the shield provided by the destruction of South Vietnam, then much of Indochina, the U.S. worked to buttress the second line of defense by supporting a military coup in Indonesia in 1965 that wiped out hundreds and thousands of landless peasants, a development which much applauded by Western liberals as vindication of the war against Vietnam, backing the imposition of a Latin American-style terror and torture state in the Philippines in 1972, etc. So you can see General Suharto, he's alluding to General Suharto, he's alluding to Indochina, the violence against Indochina, the great peoples of Asia, the great peoples of South and Central America, and the great peoples of Africa. And he's talking about the role of the United States in vicious violence. He's talking about vicious violence that guaranteed the model that they would never be able to recover from their, mass murder campaigns. The U.S. worked to buttress a second line of defense by supporting a military coup to make up for their loss in Vietnam. The great peoples of Asia and Africa and South America and Central America were at the arms of the vicious, racist, rabid white dogs of Washington. Still a further useful consequence of the attack against South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia was to ensure North Vietnamese dominance. It was clear enough by 1970, if not before, that by employing the vast resources of violence and terror at its command, the U.S. might be able to destroy the NLF in South Vietnam and independent forces in Laos and Cambodia, thus creating a situation in which, indeed, North Vietnam will necessarily dominate Indochina, for no other visible society will remain. This predictable consequence of U.S. savage bestiality is regularly invoked in retrospective justification for it, another ideologic victory that would have impressed Orwell. Note that this achievement is a special case of the device discussed earlier. When conquest fails, efforts are made to encourage assimilation to the Soviet bloc to justify further hostile acts and to limit the danger that independent success will infect others. Still another notable achievement of U.S. violence was to ensure control by the harshest element, those capable of surviving an attack of extraordinary barbarism and destructiveness. People whose homes and families are destroyed by a cruel invader have a way of becoming angry, even brutal, a fact that Westerners profess not to comprehend, having effectively suppressed the memory of their own behavior under far less onerous circumstances. Then their terrible acts can be invoked to justify the attack that helped to create this outcome. That with a docile intelligentsia and a well-behaved ideologic institutions, Western agitprop can achieve quite notable results. The U.S. is intent on winning the war in Nicaragua. In the same way, Nicaragua must first be driven to dependence on Russia to justify the attack that must be launched against it to punish it for its violation of the fifth white freedom, the freedom to rob and exploit. If this attack does not succeed in restoring the country to the happy state of Haiti or the Dominican Republic or of the Somoza years, then it at least must ensure that no successful social and economic development can place it there. The rotten apple must not be allowed to infect its barrel. It is very hard for a great power with the strength of the U.S. to be defeated in a conflict and such adversaries, and it rarely is, though a failure to achieve maximal objectives is naturally regarded as a great defeat by those limitless ambition of aims, further proof of what we are, a pitiful, helpless giant at the mercy of the yellow dwarves. The same essentially invariant nexus of principles and the assumption, often internalized by the point of lack of conscious awareness, explains another feature of U.S. international behavior: the hysteria evoked by threats to stability in countries of no economic or strategic interest in the United States, such as Laos or Grenada. In the case of Grenada, U.S. hostility was immediate after the Bishop government took power in 1979. It was seriously maintained that this speck of the Caribbean posed a security threat to the United States. Distinguished military figures and commentators issued solemn pronouncements of the threat posed by Grenada to shipping lanes in the event of a Soviet attack on Western Europe. In fact, in this event, if a Russian toothpick were found in Grenada, the island would be blown away on the unlikely assumption that such a war would last long enough for anyone to care. Laos, halfway around the world, is perhaps a still more remarkable case. Laos had actually relatively free election in 1958, despite massive U.S. efforts to subvert it. The election was won by a coalition dominated by the Pathet Lao, the communist-led anti-French guerrillas. The government was immediately overthrown by U.S. subversion in favor of a pro-Western neutralist regime, soon replaced by a right-wing military dictatorship so reactionary and corrupt that even the pro-American groups found themselves lined up with the Pathet Lao and supported by the USSR and China. By 1961, the U.S. organized army of Highland tribesmen, utterly decimated, finally as a result of their mobilization for U.S. subversion and aggression, was fighting under the leadership of former French collaborators under CIA control. Through the 60s, Pathet Lao controlled areas were subject to the fiercest bombing in history, soon to be exceeded by Cambodia in an effort to destroy the physical and social infrastructure. In the words of the Senate subcommittee, the government conceded that this bombardment was not related to the war in South Vietnam or Cambodia. This was called the American Agritrop, a secret bombing, a technical term referring to American U.S. aggression that is well known but concealed by the media, and later blamed on evil men in the government who have departed from the American way, as also in the case of Cambodia, a fact that is suppressed until today. The purpose of this attack against a country of scattered villages, against the people who may not have even known that Laos existed, was to abort a mild revolutionary nationalist movement that was attempting to bring about some reforms and popular mobilization in northern Laos. Why should such great powers as Grenada and Laos evoke this hysteria? The security arrangements are too ludicrous to consider, and it is surely not the case that the resources were too valuable to lose under the doctrine of the fifth freedom. Rather, the concern was the domino effect. Under the rotten apple theory, it follows that the tinier and weaker the country, the less endowed it is with resources, the more dangerous it is. If even a marginal or impoverished country can begin to utilize its own limited human material resources and can undertake programs of development geared to the needs of the domestic population, then others may ask, why not us? The contagion may spread, infecting others, and before long, the fifth freedom may be threatened in places that matter. So you can see the great third world peoples, the great ethnic third world peoples of South and Central America, including the great Hispanic and native Indian peoples of South America, as well as the great Asian peoples and the great African peoples. The U.S. government, walked over them. They walked over them like vicious, racist, mass-murdering, anti-ethnic, genocidal, savage butchers. We can see, when reviewing, we see the U.S. hostility in Laos. We did the bombing campaign. We did the bombing campaign and the mass murder, the torture of civilians in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, Indochina, we call it. We did it in Indonesia. And then when we finished the whole bombing campaign in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, we then just said, well, even though Congress put it together, even though Congress was 100% behind this mass murder campaign of third world Asians, white racist dogs of Congress, we still said that it was the evil president that did it so that we could avoid taking blame, so that we could defer the blame to some white god in the government. These are the racist techniques of the white frauds of the American government, the right propagandists and racist butchers, genocidal, racist, anti-third world butchers of Washington and the United States government. So continuing on, the crimes of Nicaragua. On the same grounds, we can explain the reaction of U.S. elites to the Sandinista revolution. The mood in Washington is conveyed by Representative William Alexander, who describes the lust members of Congress feel to strike out against communists. It is, in fact, notable that even congressional and media critics of the war against Nicaragua feel obliged, not only the rarest of exceptions, to make clear that they have nothing good to say about the Sandinistas. Their position, rather, is that U.S. interests do not require such an attack, or its means as inappropriate. So you can see William Alexander, the Washington representative, describes the lust members of Congress feel to strike out against communism, which is essentially third world people's sovereignty and independence. The lust, the bloodlust that Congress seeks out to strike out against sovereignty of third world, Asian, African, and South American and Central American and native peoples of the lands. That is exactly the point that we are discussing. So it is, in fact, notable that even congressional and media critics of the war against Nicaragua feel obliged, with only the rarest of exceptions, to make clear that they have nothing good to say about the Sandinistas. Their position, rather, is that U.S. interests do not require such an attack, or that it is as no means inappropriate. Only the bravest will say a word for the Sandinistas or question the president's premise that he has a perfect right to practice unlimited behavior modifications in a small peasant nation. Mary McGorry writes, what is the reason for this lust or bloodlust, this mood reminiscent of communist frenzy, but more extreme since the Iranians had sound historical reasons for hatred of their great Satan, the United States? The official claims can hardly be taken seriously, even if all minimally credible charges are accepted. The Sandinistas' record compares favorably with that of U.S. clients in the region today and in the past and elsewhere, to put it rather mildly. The conclusions that follow from comparisons within the region are too obvious for discussion among sane people. So let us consider the state that is by far the major recipient of U.S. aid, asking how it would fare under the charges brought against the Sandinistas. If the charges cannot withstand this test, then the level of hypocrisy is profound indeed. U.S. propaganda regularly denounces the failure of the Sandinistas to meet their alleged obligation to the Organization of American States. The president proclaimed in July 1983 that they had literally made a contract to establish a true democracy with the OAS before taking power in July 1979. This claim is without foundation. Roy Gutman observes that the charge, constantly reiterated by apologists for United States' atrocious behavior, was concocted as part of a successful U.S. disinformation media campaign. According to the OAS, in a July 16, 1979 telex to then General Secretary Alejandro Orfila, the Sandinistas said they planned to convoke the first free elections in the century, but made no reference to timing and said about creating a true democracy. But although the charge has no merit with regard to the Sandinistas, it does apply to Israel with considerably more force, in fact. Israel does have obligations of far more serious in nature than those falsely attributed to the Sandinistas, which it has always rejected. Israel was admitted to the UN on the express condition that it would observe UN resolutions on return or compensation of refugees. As would be expected in the age of Orwell, this charge against Nicaragua is featured prominently in Israeli propaganda journals, such as the New Republic, which naturally remains silent on Israel's obligations. Another major charge against the Nicaragua is censorship of La Prensa. A State Department official commented that the Sandinistas know that censorship is the worst thing they can do from the American point of view. Naturally, if the U.S. were being attacked by a state of unimaginable power, we would not impose censorship on a journal that offered them support and that received a $100,000 grant from the aggressor. That is, in fact, correct, since the editors and anyone remotely connected to them would be in concentration camps. Recall the fate of the Japanese during World War II. Censorship in Israel, however, is so severe that an Arab woman lecturing at the Hebrew University was denied permission even to publish an Arab language social and political journal. The Arab press in East Jerusalem was seized by the authorities when it reported settler attack against Arabs after a prisoner exchange. An Arab bi-monthly was shut down permanently in 1983, and the censor closed an Arab newspaper in Jerusalem for 3 days when it published an obituary of 2 young Arabs who died in a mysterious car explosion in 1985. 350 books are officially banned in the occupied territories, along with others known to him personally. Knesset member Mati Peleb, an Arabist and retired general, reports, including Hebrew translations of Theodore Herzl's diaries, Isaac Dusher's Non-Jewish Jew, books on Israeli military and political history, a translation to Live with Arabs by Eli Elishar, the dovish president of the Council of the Sephardic Community of Israel, a book on the religious and West Bank settlers, Gash and Numim, by the well-known Israeli journalist Danny Rubenstein, among others. Art exhibitions are censored. A Palestinian artist was given a 6-month jail sentence on the charge that the colors of the Palestinian flag appeared in the corner of a painting. Arab plays have been repeatedly banned on political grounds, and a Hebrew play by an Israeli jailed for refusing military service was banned in September 1985 on purely political grounds. Daniel Fisher reports the Hebrew press also subject to censorship as well as extensive self-censorship. Journalists are not permitted by the censor to publish abroad material that has appeared in the Hebrew press. All outgoing mail and packages are subject to censorship, and this may be opened freely by the 58 people assigned to this task. Surveillance of telephone conversations is also extensive, that the censor has intervened directly in the telephone conversation, Knesset member Michael Bar Zohar reports. But we hear no cries that the U.S. must arm and direct terrorist forces to attack Israel, nor does the U.S. Congress offer humanitarian aid, another Orwellism, to guerrilla forces resisting South African oppression or opposing the illegal South African occupation of Namibia or defending themselves against Israeli occupation in southern Lebanon. Rather, they are all terrorists whose actions we deplore. The president, always quick to defend South Africa, even justified the murderous South African attack on Botswana on the grounds that it may have been in retaliation against the African National Congress. There is no question, he said, about its violence and murdering, but about South Africa that we must withhold judgment. So I'm going to take a short break, 1-minute break. I'll be right back, and then I'll continue. We're almost finished with the chapter, and then I will continue and give you some outline. I'll give you the closing remarks. I'm glad you could join us. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank. Be right back. Okay, so continuing on, we'll be continuing. As for the humanitarian aid offered by Congress to the conquerors, this Times cites without comment the statement that rebel leader Adolfo Calero that it will be used for the purchase of at least 2 helicopters. No doubt Elliot Abrams will personally ensure that the helicopters are used solely for medical aid. Another major charge against the Sandinistas has to do with their treatment of the Mosquitos, surely the best known American Indian group in the hemisphere, and the only one whose travel merits agonized expressions of concern. That they were treated very badly by the Sandinistas is beyond question. They're also among the better treated Indians in the hemisphere. If an Indian group to their north were put forth the demands of autonomy now being considered in Nicaragua, they would simply be slaughtered if ridicule did not suffice. Mosquito leader Armstrong Wiggins holds that the arrangement the Mosquitos are demanding has never been granted by any other country in the world to indigenous peoples and goes beyond their status under the previous government, which largely ignored the Atlantic coast. Hitherto, he states, the Sandinista policies towards the indigenous people is like the Mexican policy, just like the United States policy, and just like the Chilean policy. Sandinista abuses against the Mosquitos were more massive than any other human rights violation that I'm aware of in Central America, quote unquote. So Jean Kirkpatrick, sadist in chief, testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in March 1982 at a time when thousands of Indians were being slaughtered in Guatemala and around 13,000 civilians had been murdered in El Salvador by U.S. colonial racist regimes in the preceding year alone, not to mention of torture, mutilation, starvation, semi-slave labor, and other standard free world amenities. The president claimed in the news that the Sandinistas are conducting a campaign of virtual genocide against the Mosquito Indians June 6, 1985. In fact, some 10% of Mosquito population had been removed from the war zones under a policy that was clearly prompted by military considerations and compares quite favorably to the U.S. treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And America's Watch report comments, and 21 to 24 mosquitoes had been killed in the 3 earlier years by government forces, along with 69 unresolved cases of disappearance, major atrocities, no doubt, but undetectable in the extent of the behavior of the U.S. and its clients in the region. Reviewing the human rights situation in Nicaragua, the America's Watch report finds that the Nicaraguan government atrocities, which it believes it was able to review in full, are far slighter than those U.S. organized terrorist army and have sharply declined since 1982, in contrast to those of the Contras, which can only be sampled given their scale and lack of sources. Even in the case of the Mosquitos, not the prime target of the U.S.-sponsored terrorists, America's Watch finds that the most serious abuses of mosquitoes' rights have been committed by the Contra groups, and the Contra's treatment of mosquitoes and other Indians has become increasingly more violent, while that of the government has notably improved. Mosquito leader Brooklyn Rivera comments that the FDN has been very hostile and aggressive toward us. They consider us an enemy because we maintain our independent position and will not become soldiers in someone else's army. He alleges further that the Reagan administration was blocking Mosquito unity because it wanted a group it could control under Adolfo Calero of the FDN, who the U.S. sees as the future leader of Nicaragua, and states that the U.S.-controlled Honduran military kept him and other prominent Mosquitos from entering Honduras to attend a Mosquito conference as a major part of this strategy. Again, it is pointless to compare the abuse of the Mosquitos with the wholesale slaughter conducted by U.S. clients and colonial butchers of white supremacy in Central America in the same years. So one might recall some moments of early history. For example, the Sullivan expedition against the Iroquois in 1779, pursuant to General Washington's orders that the towns and territories on the Iroquois were not merely to be overrun but destroyed. The orders were fulfilled to the hilt. Fairfax Downey records in an upbeat account of an outstanding feat of military annals, leading to the total destruction and devastation of cultivated fields and well-built towns of the North American Indians' finest civilization, north of Mexico, which richly cultivated fields and orchards, stone houses and log cabins beyond the level of most of the colonial farmers. And nothing was left but smoking ruins and desolation. All this industry and plenty was doomed to be scorched earth. One column destroyed 40 towns and 160,000 bushels of corn, along with orchards and other crops, while a smaller one destroyed hundreds and thousands of houses and 500 acres of corn. The town and field of the hostile Iroquois had been ruthlessly ravished, though one officer sadly observed that the nests have been destroyed, but the birds are still on the wing. They survived in miserable destitution after the wastage of their lands. So you can see the U.S. government, the angry white vigilante racist genocidal butchers of Washington, they accuse the Sandinistas of being, against the great indigenous Indians, the great Mosquito Indians of Nicaragua, right? For a country that is founded on the genocide of the Indian people, the genocide of third world peoples, Washington has a lot of nerve. The racist whites of Washington have a lot of nerve to make such blanket lies and deliberate fabrications. And you can see he further alludes to the fact that the Contras, the white terrorist army of the American government, the Contras of Nicaragua, were responsible for more abuses against the Sandinistas. He furthermore states that the U.S. government, the racist white government of Washington, the politicians and racist Congress, subjected to the American Japanese, the same sorts of treatment that the Sandinistas were giving to the Mosquito Indians. So it just goes to show you the hypocritical lies and deliberate falsification, fabrication, and peddling of deliberate fraud by the U.S. government just continues unchecked in this day, just as it did in the yesteryears of, the years of Theodore Roosevelt, the racist, angry white dog of Washington, as well as Woodrow Wilson and, William Howard Taft, who were, agents of murderous white supremacy of the American government. So continuing on, one we might consider one of the early exploits of our most favored client state, the massacre on October 28, 1948, at Dumaya, an undefended town north of Hebron, in an area where there had been no fighting. The massacre was conducted by a unit with tanks. Hold on one second. The massacre was conducted by a unit with tanks, leaving 580 civilians killed, according to the accounting by its Mukhtar, 100 to 350, according to Israeli sources, 1,000 according to testimonies provided in the State Department records, including 75 old men praying in a mosque and 35 families, of whom only 3 people escaped in a cave outside the destroyed towns where they took refuge. The conquest of the town, but not the massacre, was noted at once in Israel's major journal, Haaretz, in a report on the conquest of historical sites from the days of Bar Kokhba and the Romans, renewing against the connection between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. Israeli military historians say that the affair is known, though not recorded. The first report appears to be in a letter to the Labor Party journal Devar by a kibbutz member who deplores the ghetto mentality of those who refrain from expelling Arabs. He cites eyewitness testimony that by a participant who alleges that women and children were killed by crushing their skulls and sticks, and that people were blown up in houses, among other atrocities, not during the heat of battle, but as a system of expulsion and elimination. The story was finally unearthed by the correspondent for Hadishad in 1984 and presented as newly discovered. Historian Yoram Nimrod writes that the background for this slaughter and the general attitude of the time that Arabs and their possessions are fair game can be traced to the attitudes of leadership who wanted the Galilee to be free, literally clean of Arabs, and asserted that for the Arab of land of Israel, there remains only one function: to flee, David Ben-Gurion, that the country must be homogeneous and hence with as few Arabs as possible, Moshe Dayan, and who insisted that the Arab civilians who fled or had been expelled cannot and need not return, Chaim Wiseman, or even be settled nearby, even if this means rejecting the peace overtures, Ben-Gurion. Nothing comparable to these early post-independence atrocities against the indigenous population in the U.S. and Israel can be charged to the Sandinistas. Chaim Weizmann's principle was incidentally also followed by in subsequent years, notably after the 1967 war, when hundreds and thousands of Arabs fled or were expelled. A report by I.L. Ehrlich observes that much was written with much pride about Operation Refugee, which permitted 17,000 to return, but not about the fact, which he discovered in interviews with soldiers and officers, that the army was under orders which it fulfilled to kill returning refugees. Civilian women and children were killed. No one reported, no one counted the bodies, no one investigated and punished these actions taken in the pursuance of policies established by such men as Yitzhak Rabin, now Minister of Defense, Chaim Herzog, now President, and Uzi Narkis, commander of the Jordanian Front, later head of the Department of Immigration and Absorption of the Jewish Agency. A bitter irony. Soldiers were ordered to shoot even if they heard the crying of an infant. Other charges, too, have been leveled against the Sandinistas in the propaganda war. President Reagan and a representative of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, ADL, at his side, accused the Sandinistas of anti-Semitism on July 20th, 1983, somehow overlooking a cable 4 days earlier from the U.S. Embassy in Managua, stating that it could find no verifiable ground to accuse the Sandinistas of anti-Semitism and that the evidence fails to demonstrate that the Sandinistas have followed a policy of anti-Semitism or have persecuted Jews solely because of their religion. The right charges have been reiterated since, but are denied by human rights activists who are highly critical of the Sandinistas in Managua, by delegation headed by a rabbi who has been a leader in the struggle against the anti-Semitism and terror of the Argentine neo-Nazis, and by Panamanian rabbi, a former minister of government who had been honored by the Latin American Jewish Congress after a visit to Nicaragua. The Jewish Student Press Service reports that the ADL and approached presidential advisors with the idea of a deal in an effort to gain clout with the Reagan White House, accepted by the administration, who saw a way to get the Jewish community to join the bandwagon in campaign to enlist public support for its Central American policy. And the report cites officials in leading Jewish organizations who denied the charges of anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, the White House, the media, and the ADL, while generally suppressing the cable from the ambassador that reached the Reagan 4 days before July 20th accusation, also have yet to report the homilies of their favorite, Nicaraguan Archbishop Obando Bravo, who declaims that the leaders of Israel mistreated the prophets, beat them, killed them. Finally, as supreme proof of his love, God sent his divine son, but they also killed him, crucifying him. The Jews killed the prophets, and finally, the Son of God. Such idolatry calls for the sky's vengeance. The Council on Hemispheric Affairs observes that the White House keeps up a steady stream of calumny directed at Managua, charging the ruling Sandinistas with everything vile: drug running, genocide, subverting their neighbors, and now international terrorism. Charges that have not been burdened with any evidence, but are reported with only rare attempts at evaluation. This technique is the one pioneered during World War I, when the first major government propaganda agency, the Committee on Public Information, discovered that one of the best means of controlling news was flooding news channel with useless facts, or what amounted to official disinformation. Few are willing to undertake the tedious task of refuting the regular flood of lies. They have little access to the public in any event, and they always can be dismissed by the charge that they are apologists for the enemy and its actual crimes. This standard device is something used consciously as a technique to preserve the crucial right to lie in the service of the state. Or for the more deeply indoctrinated, it may simply be impossible to conceive of criticism of the Holy State as anything but support for its official enemies, principal criticisms of the divine institution being unimaginable. In either case, the discussion shifts to the evil deeds of the official enemy, and the critic can be dismissed as an apologist for these crimes, as having a double standard, etc. The holy state and the right to lie in its service are secured. The device was and still is used with tiresome regularity with reference to the Indochina Wars. A critic of the U.S. attack against South Vietnam must be a supporter of Hanoi, so one can respond to the criticism by producing true or false charges against Hanoi. And if the critic refutes false charges, that just proves that he or she is an apologist for Hanoi, as originally claimed, and there is no need to consider the original criticism of the state one serves. The same device is constantly used in the case of Central America. So you can see the U.S. government, the white frauds. It's a enterprise of frauds. It's media, it's politicians, it's racist Congress and president, it's racist mass media, it's American corporate capitalist racist frauds, and it's academic frauds. Academic frauds at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all of the Ivy League schools, as well as UC Berkeley, Michigan, just to name a few. Follow with a systematic disinformation campaign. You can see they flood the lies in the media. It's a flood of lies. And then basically the public has no idea what actually happened. That is the U.S. government approach to its genocidal butcher campaign against the great third world ethnic peoples. One would think that the transparent silliness of the procedure would embarrass its practitioners, but evidently this is not the case. There are among the reactions which anyone who undertakes the task of principal criticism to state actions or domestic institutions should expect, if the critic is not simply ignored a relatively simple matter in a deeply indoctrinated society in which private power can ensure fairly effective control over the means of expression. We return to some of the further charges about the Sandinistas. The crucial point is that they have a cumulative effect, whatever their veracity. It is well understood by Reagan's advisors that ADL and others practiced in the skills of defamation, lies, and brainwashing, that repeated charges that receive wide publicity create a lasting image, even though they are disproven point by point in critical analysis that may subsequently be noted on the back pages. The chief foreign correspondent of the London Guardian, reviewing Ray Bonner's important book cited above, comments that Bonner, who notes that he originally accepted government deception as a journalist in El Salvador, is rarely as angry about the journalists as about the officials who manipulated them. He is well enough aware that the issue in El Salvador is not really as such, but how that reality is perceived. The United States is not just conducting a political, economic, and military war, but a propaganda war as well. But he seems less exercised than he might be about the degree to which journalists accept the U.S. government line. A lie reported as fact on the front page of the New York Times affects public opinion. The same lie exposed years later by anonymous officials reminiscent or thanks to the Freedom of Information suit is mainly of interest to historians. For every expose which Mr. Bonner and the handful of other industrious reporters make, there are countless tendentious stories which are never challenged. Besides the cascade of one-sided and inaccurate reports based on untrue data or false premises, the honest and probing accounts are no better than a trickle. Meanwhile, the policy juggernaut rolls on. Furthermore, even if the media were to treat state propaganda with a critical eye in the manner employed for official enemies, the government would still have won a major battle, namely setting the framework for debate. We spend a little time analyzing the refuting Soviet charges about the terrorism of Afghan resistance or Hitler's charges against Poland in 1939, but it's more difficult, it seems, to recognize the true nature of debate over Washington's racist lie and charges against the Sandinistas at a time when it is launching its terrorist war against the Sandinistas. A fundamental reason for the great success achieved in brainwashing under freedom is that the essential premises of the state terrorists are widely shared, even among their most ardent critics, with the mainstream. As Jonathan Steele puts it more harshly, the problem is that journalists share the same narrow, ignorant assumptions as the policymakers. To take one example, consider the Boston Globe, perhaps the most consistent critics of Reagan's thuggery in Nicaragua, as they correctly describe it. Randolph Ryan of the Globe staff, the most outspoken of these critics, writes that critics have so far failed because they have not succeeded in putting forth their belief that America's strength grows from the force of its moral example. Adopting the terminology of Kissinger and others, he writes that in 1980 to 1981, there was an impression that the revolutionary left on the red in Central America was on a roll in Central America. The administration correctly saw the infectious spirit of the left on a roll as a virus that had to be stopped. But now Nicaragua is no longer a subversive virus and has become just an opportunity to win a cheap victory. Illustrated here are some of the essential contributions of critics to reinforcing state terror. First, we have the reference to the force of America's moral examples, as if history demonstrates any such truth. Second, the observed administration claim that the attack on Nicaragua was motivated by its alleged role arming the guerrillas in El Salvador is accepted. And more important, it is explicitly assumed that if Nicaragua were indeed providing arms to people being massacred by U.S. clients, then this crime would merit retribution, just as writers in Pravda, no doubt, thunder about the crimes of Pakistan and the U.S. in aiding the feudal bandits who are terrorizing Afghanistan. But most important is the shared belief that the infectious virus must be stopped by force if necessary. The virus, of course, was never the flow of arms to El Salvador, but rather the threat of a successful independent third world development under the principles of the rotten apple theory. And if this doctrine is accepted, then the administration has a strong case. If evidently this danger has not been averted, so there is every reason on the premise that Ryan and Reagan share to continue the low-intensity war to ensure suffering, discontent, inability to develop any constructive programs, and the rise to power of the harshest elements who will be dependent on the Soviet bloc, thus providing retrospective justification for the attack. As was true during the war against South Vietnam, then all of Indochina, the contributions of mainstream critics to entrenching the doctrines of the state religion is a crucial one, which is why they are tolerated and indeed honored for their courage and decency. So you can see in summarizing, basically the flow of arms to El Salvador is not really the state terror that is enforced by the transfer of arms to El Salvador is not the issue at hand, right? The issue at hand is actually the Sandinistas, the rotten apples, getting, sovereignty, the third world peoples asking simply to be able to control their birthright resources of their natural resources, such as oil or their, rubber plantations or their, farm plantations or their rice exports or, any sorts of things that they have to control. But the U.S. rips that away. The racist whites of Washington, the angry, genocidal, vigilante, lynch mob whites of the American government, rip away the third world peoples, the great ethnic peoples' resources are whipped away by the sadistic butchers of Washington. As was true during the war in South Vietnam, then all of Indochina, the contribution of mainstream critics to entrenching the doctrines of the state religion is a crucial one, which is why they are tolerated, indeed honored for their courage and decency. The irrelevance of government claims about the war against Nicaragua is evident from the way the motivation shifts from circumstances as circumstances demand. At one point, the attack was justified by the need to prevent arms flow to El Salvador. By 1983, the significant arms flow having been detected despite massive efforts, the aim was to bring the Sandinistas to the bargaining table and force them to hold elections. In June 1984, the president told Congress that U.S. aid to the Contras must continue to pressure the Sandinistas to negotiate. Unless we do, he said, a regional settlement based on the Contradora principles would continue to elude us. A few months later, elections had been held. The Sandinistas had accepted the Contradora principles, causing the administration to discover suddenly that they were a sham and a fraud, and they were continuing to request negotiations that the U.S. refuses. So the argument shifted again. We read in the news columns that the Reagan administration has demanded that Nicaragua demilitarize, reduce its ties with the Soviet Union and Cuba, and change its form of government to a pluralistic democracy. A moment's thought suffices to show that the best way to bring Nicaragua to demilitarize and cut its ties with the Soviet bloc would be to accept the Contadora agreements blocked by U.S. pressure and to call off the war, and that the commitment of the Reagan administration or its predecessors to pluralistic, quote-unquote, democracy in Central America is as believable as the Soviet commitment to socialism or democracy in its domains. But its drivel, for that is all that it is blandly reported as news in the nation's press. Nothing could be more plain than the absurdity of the whole game in which the media play their assigned role, earnestly reporting each pretense and occasionally commenting on the weakness of the argument or the inconsistency of the highly consistent and rational policy. The real reasons for the lust to destroy the Sandinista regime have nothing to do with the charges that are raised, whether valid or simply concocted. That is obvious enough. The Oxfam report on Sandinista social successes inspires real fear. Useless tanks do not. The real reasons are based on the argument that President Wilson regarded as unanswerable. The interests of the people of Latin America are an incident, not an end. What is paramount is a narrowly conceived American interest, the protection of our raw materials, the fifth freedom to rob and exploit. We must therefore become deeply concerned when some group becomes infected by this heresy directed by U.S. intelligence. The idea that the government has direct responsibility for the welfare of the people, what U.S. political theology calls communism, in our third world domains, whatever the commitments of its advocates. In the real world, as we shall see in more detail directly, the U.S. has consistently opposed human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democracy, using harsh measures where necessary. These policies are natural concomitants of the geopolitical conceptions that have motivated planning and that are deeply rooted in American institutions. It is not surprising, for example, that the U.S. should react with extraordinary hostility to democracy in Laos, or should overthrow the only democratic government in the history of Guatemala, keeping in power a series of mass murderers ever since. It is familiar to students of U.S. policy that while paying lip service to the encouragement of representative democracy in Latin America, quote unquote, the United States has a strong interest in just the reverse, apart from procedural democracy, quote unquote, especially the holding of elections, which only too often have proved farcical. The reason is that democracies may tend to be responsive to popular needs, while the United States has been concerned with fostering the most favorable conditions of her private overseas investment. United States concern for representative democracy in Latin America is a facet of her anti-communist policy. There has been no serious question of her intervening in the case of many right-wing military coups, from which, of course, this policy has generally benefited. It is only when their own concept of democracy, closely identified with the private white capitalist enterprise, is threatened by communism, or to be more accurate, by independent third world development, whether capitalist, socialist, or whatever, that she has felt impelled to demand collective action to defend it. It is only when some form of democracy contributes to maintaining the fifth freedom to rob and exploit from the third world that the United States will tolerate it. Otherwise, terror and torture states will have to do. For these real-world considerations, one can come up to understand that lust to strike out against Nicaragua or Allende or Cuba or the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. It is not because of the abuses of human rights and democratic principle, often real, sometimes despicable, but rarely approaching what we tolerate with equanimity, directly support or carry out ourselves. Rather, U.S. policy towards Nicaragua is immediately predictable from the fact that priorities of the new government meant that Nicaraguans' poor majority would have access to and be primary beneficiaries of public programs. The fact that infant mortality fell so dramatically that Nicaragua won an award from the World Health Organization for the best health achievement in a third world nation. Health standards and literacy sharply improved as successful agrarian reform was carried out. GDP expanded by 5% in 1983. In contrast to other countries in this region, production and consumption of corn, beans, and rice rose dramatically, and Nicaragua came close to self-sufficiency than any other Central American nation, and made the most impressive gains of any Latin American nation in the quality of life index. The Overseas Development Council, based on literacy, infant mortality, and life expectancy. Burns comments that Nicaragua should, in many ways, stand as an example for Central America, not its outcast. The grim social statistics from Honduras, a country in which the population is literally starving to death, stand in sharp contrast to the recent achievements of Nicaragua. That is just the point. The infection must be stopped before it spreads. Similarly, the crime of the Allende government was that it quickly raised production and real wages, conducted an effective agrarian reform, and such programs as milk distribution for children, measures that increased consumer demand and permitted industry to take advantage of unutilized capacity and idle labor. And worse, did so under parliamentary democracy, though such dangerous progress would not long persist as the Nixon-Kissinger destabilization policy designed to make the economy scream, in Nixon's words, had its effects along with the other factors. Similarly, the U.S. policy towards Cuba is greatly explained by the quality of life index of the Overseas Development Council, which placed Cuba well above any other Latin American country and approximately equal to the U.S., actually better than the U.S. if we consider it more egalitarian character, thus with lower infant mortality rates than Chicago and far more lower rates than the Navajo Indian Reservation. Tom Farrar of Rutgers Law School, member of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the OAS and the former State Department Assistant for Inter-American Affairs, writes that there is a consensus among the scholars of a wide variety of ideologic positions that on the level of life expectancy, education, and health, Cuban achievement is considerably greater than one would expect from its level of per capita income. A recent study of 113 third world countries in terms of these basic indicators in popular welfare ranked Cuba first, ahead of even Taiwan, which is probably the outstanding example of growth with equity within a capitalist framework. Data in the 1981 World Development Bank of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development also support the consensus. Cuba excelled according to all main indicators of human needs satisfaction. What has changed remarkably is not much the gross indicators as those that reflect the changed conditions of the poor, particularly the rural poor. In 1958, one rural hospital in the entire country represented about 2% of the hospital facilities in Cuba. By 1982, there were 117 hospitals, or about 35% of all hospitals in Cuba. Furthermore, polio and malaria have been eliminated in Cuba, and the causes of death have shifted from those associated with understandable development, underdevelopment, disease of early infancy, etc., to those of the developed world, congenital abnormalities, diabetes, obesity, etc. These are the crimes for which Cuba must pay dearly, the real ones of little interest to policymakers, except for their propagandist effect. As for the NLF in South Vietnam, its crime was explained ruefully by the bitterly anti-communist journalist Dennis Warner. Its hundreds of villages all over Southeast Asia, the only people working at the grassroots for an uplift of people's living standards are the communists. The reason for the people's support that forced the U.S. to resort to violence and undermine any political settlement. Those who set the priorities in this way are evidently deficient in the understanding of U.S. needs and priorities. They have therefore joined the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy and must be driven into the hands of the Russians and subjected to the aggression, terror, embargo, and other means in accord with their status as an incident, not an end. We turn next to a closer examination of just how it is done. So that is, basically turning the tide, U.S. intervention in Central America, The chapter title is The Fifth Freedom, the freedom to rob and exploit by the U.S. white capitalist and racist American government genocidal butchers and how they terrorize the third world peoples. So I just want to summarize the last few sections. So the great third world peoples, the great Hispanic peoples, the great native Indian peoples of South America, the great African peoples, the great Indochinese peoples, including the great Vietnamese, the great Cambodian, the great Laotian, Buddhist peoples, Christian peoples, and all other peoples, as well as the great Chinese people and the great Korean peoples. These are the great third world peoples. And these are the peoples that the U.S. government, the racist white frauds of Washington, choose to submit to genocidal butchery and terrorist, angry white vigilante lynch mob sort of campaigns in these countries. All of them have been subjected to U.S. colonial butchers, racist American white colonial butchers, and, funded in lavish by Washington. Their regimes are colonial dictatorships that were white dictatorships that used terror and torture across the board. We discussed basically all of the different countries, including Nicaragua, most importantly, Nicaragua, Vietnam, and Cuba. Those three countries tried to uplift their people. They called it communist. The U.S. white frauds called it communist in the event of trying to subordinate them and oppress them and keep them as slaves. Remember, the Vietnamese and the Indochinese, Laotians, Cambodians, and Vietnamese were kept as plantation slaves by the French monarchy. The French, autocracy or bureaucracy had kept the slaves in its colonial administration, where they worked 14 hours a day. That's similar to the Cubans. The Cubans were enslaved by the U.S. and British plantation owners that put them to work up plantations and kept them enslaved at the butt of a pistol. The white racist American government and the British governments kept these third world peoples enslaved at the butt of the pistol. That was the same with the Nicaraguans. The Nicaraguans were enslaved as plantation owners. They were finally freed from their plantation slavery. Many things happened, many changes occurred, but they were finally freed from plantation slavery. They still had to work 14 to 15 hours a day. So the U.S. government, seeing these things, they called it communist. They want, basically their only, fault is to look for sovereignty and independence. And the white racist, angry butchers of Washington had to stop that. They forced the great third world peoples of South and Central America, of Asia, including the Indonesian, the Indochinese, including the Vietnamese, Laotians, and, Cambodians, as well as the great Chinese and Korean peoples. They forced them into subjugation and colonial rogue state regimes. And that is what we are seeing in the Turning the Tide. Just one example is Latin America. We have many other books. We have books about Asia. I have another book that I will be doing a little later. The name of the book is At War with Asia. It is also by Noam Chomsky. It is about the Indo-Chinese conflict, including Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, the great Laotian, Cambodian, and Vietnamese people. And then I have another book. It's called Killing Season. This book is called Killing Season. It is about the great Indonesian people. All of these are the great third world peoples who had to struggle against white racist, angry, vigilante supremacists of the U.S. government, angry, vigilante, genocidal American white butchers. So we're going to close. We're going to do a quick closing. It's going to be a short closing. Again, the book link will be in the beginning of the description. The great Hispanic peoples, the great Native Indian peoples, the great African peoples, and the great Asian peoples, all of which comprise the great peoples of the third world, were endurers of torture and abuse and rape, murdered at the hands of the U.S. government, colonial, bestial white butchers and their European allies, for which the U.S. government remains silent in a vicious campaign of sadistic hate and cruel bestial savagery. The racist anti-third world ethnic peoples, mass murders, American politicians and president allowed these things to happen without check or inquiry. Their media and academia frauds and angry whites slaughtered the great third world peoples, including Hispanics, including those from South and Central America, including Native Indians, Indonesians, Chinese, Indochinese, including Cambodians, Laotians, and Vietnamese, and Africans, including South Africans, Mozambique, and Angola, and hid these crimes like vicious, murderous, criminal, sadistic butchers, premeditated American racist, vigilante, white, anti-third world ethnic people, racist murderers were totally reckless and remorseless in their crimes against these great third world peoples. Angry white supremacists and sadistic, cruel, detached, racist American white butchers of Roman Catholicism have blatant disregard for third world peoples and remain enemies of the third world's search for liberation and democracy. Masters of subversion and ethnic third world savage butchery, the American government enslaves the great third world peoples for their capitalist, angry white frauds of European and American corporations. The hateful white vigilante racist peoples of America murder ethnic people recklessly and remorselessly and without shame. We must discuss the actions of the mass murdering sadists of Washington and the United States in Latin America, Asia, and Africa in the context of butchery of the great third world ethnic peoples of these lands. The angry white people fail to sympathize or even be knowledgeable of their hideous crimes against these great third world peoples. The U.S. government, as we discussed in the article, maintains several freedoms. The white racist, hateful, anti-third world, and anti-ethnic vigilante butchers of America provide freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press or freedom from want, and freedom of assembly. But the white butchers of America have one more freedom, the freedom to rob and exploit from the great Hispanic and Native Indians and the great Asian and African peoples. This freedom is often used in genocide against these people, when you can't take money secretly and covertly, like Washington so often does, without anyone even knowing about their fabrications, falsifications, omissions, and deliberate lies, then you must take it by force. This requires sadistic murder by U.S. government, white agents of Congress, and the president. The propaganda system is set up by the cruel sadists of the American Congress and president. They inform the agenda to their white frauds in the New York Times and Washington Post. And as we saw, provide their quote-unquote prestigious frauds with the news that they need printed. These are often news that involve the need to mass murder people, but framed in a way that the people targeted, always the third world ethnic peoples, including the great Hispanic, Asian, and African peoples, have some problems. That allows them to build a case to cause sadistic cruelty in order to achieve the ends of slavery, rape, murder, and torture. That is the white, angry, vigilante American Congress and president. For example, in Jimmy Carter's term, Jose Napoleon Duarte was the leader of the El Salvadoran regime. Mr. Carter, the human rights, quote-unquote, democratic, white, fraud, sadistic, detached, murderous, bestial butcher, backed a coup in El Salvador to bring a vicious regime to power in 1979. The killing of the great Hispanic and great Indian natives of El Salvador then dramatically increased. This murderous junta collapsed in front of Carter and was replaced by another murderous regime, which Carter continued to funnel money into and continued the slaughter fest started by the U.S. butchers and Congress. Children were thrown against rocks. Amputations were constant, and paralysis and spinal cord injury were caused by shotgun injuries to the children and infants. Carter also backed Somoza, who waged war against the residential great Hispanic and great Indian natives of Nicaragua, and responsible for hundreds and thousands of murders. The sadistic, cruel butchers in Washington even went so far as to try to replace Somoza and institute Somocismo, or Somoza policies, without Somoza, despite popular opinion in Nicaragua being for the Sandinistas and not for a military junta. This is in keeping with the U.S. sadists in Congress and presidency, who work to ensure that the subjugated great Hispanic and great Native Indian third world peoples will remain in an oppressive stranglehold for eternity. Carter promoted the destruction of schools and universities in El Salvador and relegated free speech and free expression to the grave in this great land. Additionally, the independent Salvadoran media was targeted by the racist butcher Jimmy Carter. As we said, free speech and expression were relegated to the grave in the third world lands by the U.S. white racist angry vigilantes. The independent Salvadoran media was targeted by the racist butcher Jimmy Carter and was also responsible for the colonial white dictatorial regime of Guatemala, which committed 99% of its atrocities using American genocidal hardware. Cruel, sadistic torture, terror techniques against the great Hispanic and native Indian Guatemalan people were carried out by placing them in battery acid and burning them to death in front of their families as a retributive action for existing in Guatemala. The racist, angry, white vigilante lynch mob butchers of the American government denied all these crimes and stated they were just ordinary events caused by guerrillas or right-wing extremists. Similar to their action against the great Indochinese peoples, the revolutionary forces in Vietnam were far less destructive than the angry white dictatorship of Ngo Dinh Diem, a ruthless butcher that used state terror to slaughter the civilian Vietnamese population, funded and lavished by American white fraud politicians in Congress and President Lyndon Johnson, the sadist-in-chief from 1963 to 1969. The population was forcibly removed and placed into concentration camps, and there was ecocide in which crops were sprayed, causing complete destruction of all forms of life in Indochina. The Vietnamese people were starved by the angry white vigilantes of Washington, who found that by causing the destruction of a land, they could create a state of sheer violence that could then lead them to not be the aggressor and morally justified for mass murder of the third world peoples. The moral justification is rather humorous in light of Washington's record on morality, in which the great third world peoples of Indochina were genocided by American weapons troops, including torture squads and death squads, and were lavishly funded by the racist whites of Washington. The same holds true for El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. In March 1980, Duarte of El Salvador conducted a war of extermination and genocide against the great Hispanic and native Indian peoples of this land. American white frauds of Congress over-exaggerated the guerrilla force's strength so that an unleashing of bestial American murder could be propagated against the poor people of this land. It is, as usual, an example of the bestial, savage American whites of Washington. As Dr. Chomsky states, the suffering of the third world people is due to the racist, jealous hate of the white congressional politicians and presidents. They have delusions of third world health and wealth and follow their delusions with murderous campaigns of oppression, terror, including mutilation, burning, arm and leg amputations, spine paralysis by snapping the neck, and such vicious actions. The American government white butchers are thugs, and when they get jealous feelings, which is 99% of the time, they seek to assuage those feelings through murder of the great third world, Hispanic and native Indian, the Indochinese great peoples of Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos, as well as the great peoples of Indonesia and China and Korea. As their racist whites complain about the Asian people's theft, their criminal murder of 5 million plus Indonesians and 3+ million Cambodians, Vietnamese, and Laotians remains hidden. Because if we hide it, our racist brothers in Europe won't know that we murdered, and we would be breaking European laws. So we can't lynch the Asians or Hispanic peoples anymore. We have to just pretend that we never hurt them, like a sadistic, detached, bestial American savage government, genocidal, anti-third world butcher. So that's it. We're going to come back in 2 days on Monday. Next week, I will have 5 days of this. I will basically do one topic a day. I'll finish the book. This book will be done. I'll start the At War with Asia book. It'll be a great deal of continuous knowledge. I hope you enjoyed it. Please come back tomorrow. I'll have the link for the book in the beginning of the description section of the podcast. Hope you can enjoy it. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.